Hello and welcome to Frank Philosophy, where we speak frankly about philosophy. I'm your host, Frank. I have a BA, an MPhil, and a PhD in philosophy, and I teach philosophy at a university far, far away. And today we'll be looking at a text from the early modern period by René Descartes called The Discourse on the Method of Rightly Conducting the Reason and Seeking Truth in the Sciences. Another way to put it, this is just how Descartes thinks you can become as smart as he is. That's basically what this is. It's a manual for what we might call today critical thinking, where we're focused on just how to get smarter. This is Descartes' manual on how to get smarter, or how he conceives of how he got so smart himself, because he was a pretty smart guy, and he thought pretty highly of himself, to say the least. So he was generous enough with his time to write down for us a manual on his method of properly conducting our reason and seeking truth in the sciences. Now, on the one hand, this is rather, a bit indulgent of him, but at the same time, it's not all that different from your typical, self-help or how to Diary of a CEO type works that you see nowadays on bestseller lists. So this is kind of a version of one of those from the 17th century, 17th century, right? This was published when was this published? 1637. And if you've ever taken an Intro to Philosophy course, you may have been assigned this. But at least in my experience, the more common of Descartes' philosophical writings that get assigned in a philosophy intro course is going to be the Meditations. And the Meditations is, it's a bit more traditional of a philosophical work in the sense that it focuses almost entirely on the ideas, right? There's not much autobiography. Even though it is written from the first person, famously, it's Descartes in his bathrobe meditating or whatever. But this piece is a bit more autobiographical. It's a bit less formal. It was written in French, so the vernacular, rather than Latin, which most philosophical writings were written in. So this is really his attempt to sort of tell the world what he thinks is the best way to be using your brain, to be using your mind. And he's certainly, he's got some credibility as one to be writing this, given, just how much, how involved he was in science of the time, back in the day, and his impact on intellectual history in Europe and beyond from that time onward. So, for example, if you've ever heard of a Cartesian plane, right, your X and Y axis, that's based on the writings that he produced, namely his book, I think it's just called The Geometry. And this work right here, The Discourse on Method, was supposed to be a preface to that book. But I guess it was published separately or something like that. We do get a lot of Descartes' philosophy here that would go on to become what's known as Cartesianism, which gets its full treatment in the Meditations a little bit later on in history. But here you get sort of the Cliff Notes versions and Descartes' personal coming around to his method in a slightly less formal setting. So it's kind of interesting. And there's also some really fun autobiographical stuff here as well. So you get to know Descartes a little bit too. And he also talks about a few different topics, not just the I think therefore I am, which actually this is the text where that first is written in those words exactly. I think therefore I am. The Meditations doesn't actually exactly have that phrasing. It was originally here in this work. So you get most of what comes out in the Meditations here. You get the argument for, the existence of the self. You get your rationalism. You get your method of doubt. You get the immortality of the soul. You get the existence of God. So it's kind of like I want to say like an autobiographical kind of Cliff Notes version of the Meditations. But It's maybe for that reason a bit easier to digest. It's certainly a lot of fun, I think, as a text. But it's also longer. It's shorter than the meditations, but it's longer than anything else I've done on this channel so far. So I think this is going to be a two-parter. I wasn't sure if I should just like YOLO it and go through the whole thing in one video. Which, I mean, I don't see that happening. But, you know, with 44 pages, I'm assuming like 2 videos of about 3 hours each is probably what we're looking at here. But we'll see. We'll go through it. I read this a while ago, and I loved it. But I haven't actually read it recently, so I'll be going through this with you, the audience, just, you know, for the first time in a while, and giving my thoughts along the way. It's should be enlightening. So, without further ado, once again, yes, this is the public domain translation by John Veach, and I took this from Project Gutenberg, but again, reformatted it. There are no notes and no copyright issues to worry about, so we should be good to go. There are better translations maybe out there, I suppose. I think, you know, anybody who knows French, well, I don't think French is quite as difficult to translate as something like ancient Chinese or ancient Greek, where the translation could be, you know, much different. So I'm not too worried about translation issues here using a public domain translation, even though it's a bit old and probably will include some old-timey sounding phrases. And again, that's what I'm here for. Okay. Without further ado, let's get into the discourse on the method of rightly conducting the reason and seeking truth in the sciences by René Descartes. Okay, prefatory note by the author, so this is by Descartes. If this discourse appears too long to be read at once, it may be divided into 6 parts. Right, so there's Descartes saying, like, well, if you're not hardcore enough to just sit down and read this thing in one sitting, I guess you can read it in 6 different parts. So thanks for that. And in the first will be found various considerations touching on the sciences. In the second, the principal rules and the method which the author has discovered. In the third, certain of the rules of morals which have been deduced from the method. And in the fourth, reasoning by which he establishes the existence of God and of the human soul, which are the foundations of his metaphysic. In the fifth, the order of the physical questions which he has investigated, and in particular the explication of the motion of the heart and some other difficulties pertaining to medicine, as also the difference between the soul of a man and that of the brutes. And in the last, what the author believes to be required in order to greater advancement in the investigation of nature than has yet been made, with the reasons that have induced him to write. Okay, good. So that is like a nice, helpful summary of what Descartes' going to get up to. So I guess, again, like he's using this term science, and science probably was something very new. At least, well, this is the modern period. Historically, that's what we call it. This was, 1630s, right? 1640s, early 17th century. And, you know, this was when things like experimentation and was starting to really get off the ground. This was when you had like the beginnings of the Enlightenment period, and you had all sorts of people doing crazy, weird experiments. You saw massive advances in medicine, and this was in large part due to like people suddenly having more access to bodies, which was like kind of a taboo subject earlier on in the Middle Ages, but now weirdos like Descartes started dissecting as many bodies as they could get their hands on, and learning a whole lot of really important stuff on medicine. So that's why, you know, it's a sign of things to come. The motion of the heart and basically the circulatory system. I don't know if he like discovered that the heart pumps blood and it circulates throughout the body. I don't want to say he discovered that, but he certainly played a role in. He learned things about that process that we didn't know before. So he wrote on a lot of stuff, even though, again, like usually if you take an intro course and you learn the meditations, or you read the meditations, that's all you get out of Descartes. But he did a whole bunch of other stuff too. And I mean, philosophy was just one of his many intellectual products. So it's cool. Again, I like the Discourse on Method because it gives you that stuff too. You know, it lets you know, like, what did he really think was important, intellectually speaking. Okay. Right. So he'll say some general things about science. He'll give his method, right? So method for how to use your brain the right way, how to make sure that you don't get off track, and how to use reason in a way that maximizes your chances of arriving at the truth, really. So how to get smarter, basically, how to know more true things. And then, interestingly, in the third section, we get a little bit of ethics, right? He applies his method to the domain of conduct, right? In the domain of ethics. I mean, well, I use that term loosely, ethics, but like in personal conduct, right? How to conduct yourself in a way that's rational and makes sense, right? Because that's supposed to follow from this method of arriving at truth. And then in the fourth, fifth, and sixth, well, in the fourth, we get God and the soul, right? Again, this is very similar to the meditations, which also has, I think it's meditations 3 and 4, which are about God and the soul, right? But here it's just he lumps them together in the fourth meditation, which is quite long. And then in the fifth meditation, right, he talks about, right, like I said, medicine, the circulation, and his love for science, basically, as well as like the difference between human souls and animal souls. So you get like some cool, modern period metaphysics about the soul and things like that. And then this last part, this sixth part, is basically like a justification of why he's writing this, which, like, I mean, it might not seem so weird nowadays to like write books about like how you think the world should be in the language that you grew up, or like how you think people should act, or what's, like I said, I mean, people write autobiographies all the time, and people have for a while, but to really like stake your view of how thinking should be done and how people should conduct themselves as a result of understanding the way people should be thinking better than, most, I suppose. That was kind of new, especially writing philosophy and science and adjacent sort of texts in your own language, right? Like in French, not in Latin. So he feels like he needs to make a case for like, why even write this sort of thing? Okay. We are good. Okay. So that's the division of things. And like I said, I think we'll probably get through like the first 3. I don't see us getting through the whole thing in one sitting, but yeah, let's just do it. Let's do it. Okay. Part 1. Good sense is of all things among men. Sorry. Let me just try that again. Sorry. Part 1. Good sense is, of all things among men, the most equally distributed. For everyone thinks himself so abundantly provided with it that even those who are the most difficult to satisfy in everything else do not usually desire a larger measure of this quality than they already possess. Descartes' very sassy. Okay. So, this is basically like sort of a classic Enlightenment statement that everybody is born with the faculty of reason. Everybody has like a certain level of reason, or what he calls good sense, right? Like we all can use our brains and in pretty reliable ways that no other creature can. And this faculty is equally distributed throughout the human race, right? Even right among those people who maybe aren't so smart, right? Smart, quote unquote, who are like stubborn and closed-minded. Usually they don't wish that they were smarter. And that's like kind of, right? The most stubborn and self-assured people are usually convinced that they're right about everything and they don't need any more rationality or sense than they have currently because they know everything, right? Isn't that nice? So there's like a little bit of sass in the very first sentence from Descartes. And in this, it is not likely that all are mistaken in the conviction is rather to be held as testifying that the power of judging aright and of distinguishing truth from error, which is properly what is called good sense or reason, is by nature equal in all men. Right. So again, this is the classic Enlightenment. Everybody, by virtue of being human, is born with the capacity for reason and for judging and distinguishing truth from error. Right. So we recognize some things as true, we recognize some things as false, and we have reasons for why we think those things are true and why we think those things are false. And that the diversity of our opinions, consequently, does not arrive from some being endowed with a larger share of reason than others, but solely from this that we conduct our thoughts along different ways and do not fix our attention on the same objects. Okay, so now he's explaining, well, then where does the diversity of what appears to be sense come from? Like, why do people disagree? Where does disagreement come from, even on really important and central topics? And he's saying it's not because some people have more reason. Some people are more rational than others, right? It's not that some people are, have a higher capacity for reason and judgment than others. Everybody has that equally. The difference is that we conduct our thoughts along different ways, right? And we don't focus on the same objects, right? So we just pay attention to different things. That's why we disagree. It's not because we're fundamentally different from one another in our capacity for reason. It's because we're just not focused on the same things. That's the reason. That's why. For to be possessed of a vigorous mind is not enough. The prime requisite is rightly to apply it. Right? So people aren't better or worse because of their capacity for reason, because that's equal in everybody, right? So that can't be what distinguishes one group of people from another, right? It's about how do they use reason, how rightly to apply our faculty of reason. And that's why, from the title, right, of rightly conducting the reason, right, the faculty of reason. So that's what this is about. This is about how do we use this reason, this faculty, right, this ability to judge true and false and things like that. How do we use that in a way that's maximally reliable and good? The greatest minds, as they are capable of the highest excellences, are open likewise to the greatest aberrations, and those who travel very slowly may yet make far greater progress, provided they keep always to the straight road, than those who, while they run, forsake it. So I guess this is about being persistent, following the straight and narrow, applying a method and sticking to it over time, not getting distracted by things, and even moving slowly and making careful, painstaking progress on a problem or an issue, right? And he'll return to this theme when we get to his ideas about ethics and how to be a good, or the best way to conduct oneself, right? But this is just like sort of a teaser for that. For myself, I have never fancied my mind to be in any respect more perfect than those of the generality. On the contrary, I have often wished that I were equal to some others in promptitude of thought, or in clearness and distinctness of imagination, or in fullness and readiness of memory. So this is Descartes' kind of tricky. Like, on the one hand, he seems so sure and full of himself, but on the other hand, when he expresses modesty, he does so in a way that's really convincing, like this, where when he says, I've never fancied my mind to be any more perfect, or to be in any respect more perfect than other people's, right? So I've never thought that I have a better working brain than other people. That's not why I'm so smart, right? Because he does think that he's smart, and for good reason, right? He's made lots of advances in many different fields, and he spent his life learning stuff and applying it and writing and thinking deeply about stuff. Like, that's kind of what he did for his whole life, so it's no surprise, really. But on the contrary, he's ready to admit that, like, yeah, I deal with people, or I interact with people who, like, are quicker to bring forth ideas, or who have a better sense of imagination, right? Who can remember things better than me, right? So, like, those kinds of things, like, yeah, maybe there are differences, but I'm not perfect in all those respects. And besides these, I know of no other qualities that contribute to the perfection of the mind. For as to the reason or sense, inasmuch as it is that alone which constitutes us men and distinguishes us from the brutes, I am disposed to believe that it is to be found complete in each individual. Right, so he's saying that, like, this kind of stuff, right, being, being able to remember stuff and have a good sense of imagination, right? These are the things where, some people seem better than others, right? Some people seem better than others in these things. That he's going to go on to say that, I guess, these things can be trained. I think that's what he's saying here, right? That like, reason is complete in each of us. Right? Reason is something that we all share, and we all share equally, right? But this other stuff, right? Clearness and distinctness of imagination, or fullness and readiness of memory, that's where there's variation, right? That's where there's variation, and maybe that's where our natural abilities differ. And on this point, to adopt the common opinion of philosophers who say that the greater difference, or the difference of greater and less, holds only among the accidents, and nothing among the forms or natures of individuals of the same species. Right, so he's agreeing. He's saying that, like, the differences between people mentally, right, in terms of their intelligence, is accidental, right? Meaning that it's not essential to us, right? The fact that we all have reason, the capacity for reason, the capacity to use reason, and judge things as true and false, like, right? That faculty, that capacity, that ability, that's necessary in all human beings. But this other stuff, right? Like, whether the thoughts come quickly, or whether, you can imagine things clearly and distinctly, or whether you can remember stuff quickly, like, that's not really what matters. Those are all accidental. Yeah. Okay. I will not hesitate, however, to avow my belief that it has been my singular good fortune to have very early in life fallen in with certain tracts which have conducted me to considerations and maxims of which I have formed a method that gives me the means, as I think, of gradually augmenting my knowledge and of raising it little by little and to the highest point which the mediocrity of my talents and the brief duration of my life will permit me to reach. This is nice, right? So he's saying, well, I am fortunate, however, in so far as I've been able to spend my whole life learning, and that's a privilege, right? That's something that I'm really grateful for. So he's expressing his gratitude here that, because I've been able to spend so much time learning from various schools of thought, various thinkers, and this, that, and the other, I've been able to accumulate what I take to be knowledge throughout the course of my brief life. For I have already reaped from it such fruits that, although I have been accustomed to think lowly enough of myself, and although when I look with the eye of a philosopher at the varied courses and pursuits of mankind at large, I find scarcely one which does not appear in vain and useless, I nevertheless derive the highest satisfaction from the progress I conceive myself to have already made in the search after truth, and cannot help entertaining such expectations of the future as to believe that if, among the occupations of men as men, there is anyone really excellent and important, It is that which I have chosen. Okay, so, jeez. Well, I guess he's saying that, like, he's kind of satisfied with his life, and he's kind of satisfied with the progress that he's made, at least insofar as possible, right? He's not saying that he's done everything perfectly, but at least he's been able to spend such a significant portion of his life trying to pursue the truth that it feels good, right? That it seems worthwhile when he looks back, even though many lives are imperfect, and at least when you're a philosopher and you look at the goings on and the pursuits of humankind at large, a lot of what people do seems kind of silly and pointless, right? Because it's just so far removed from the wise and meaningful life of philosophy and the pursuit of knowledge and truth. Okay. After all, it is possible I may be mistaken, and it is but a little copper and glass, perhaps, that I take for gold and diamonds. I know how very liable we are to delusion in what relates to ourselves, and also how much the judgments of our friends are to be suspected when given in our favor. But I shall endeavor in this discourse to describe the paths I have followed and to delineate my life as in a picture, in order that each one may also be able to judge of them for himself, and that in the general opinion entertained of them as gathered from current report, I myself may have a new help towards instruction to be added to those I have been in the habit of employing. So what does that mean? Well, he's saying, well, I could be wrong, right? I could be wrong about my own progress and my own commitment to the search of truth, and maybe my method's wrong. I'm not sure, and I am flawed, I am imperfect, I am human after all. But I'm gonna just say what I think works and what has worked for me so far, and hopefully that's helpful to other people. And if people read what I write and think that I'm wrong, then they'll hopefully tell me, and then we can all get smarter together, right? So this is like, the use of dialogue and the dialectic and a method of inquiry that's collaborative, right? And that's why he's doing it, because he wants to say, like, look, here's what I think is the best way to get smarter and learn more and things like that. What do you think? Right? Do you agree or disagree? Now, of course, in his own writings, especially his he has various correspondences with different philosophers, especially many philosophers, and he doesn't seem very receptive to criticism, basically, including women philosophers who wrote to him, and I think I'll definitely do a video on one correspondence in particular that's worth exploring in detail. But nevertheless, at least presented here, it's quite admirably humble in his discussion of, or in his his rationale for writing all this. My present design, then, is not to teach the method. My present design, then, is not to teach the method which each ought to follow for the right conduct of his reason, but solely to describe the way in which I have endeavored to conduct my own. Right? So I'm not trying to teach you what you should be doing. I'm just telling you what works for me. Right? They who set themselves to give precepts must, of course, regard themselves as possessed of greater skill than those to whom they prescribe. And if they err in the slightest particular, they subject themselves to censure. But as this tract is put forth merely as a history, or, if you will, as a tale, in which amid some example worthy of imitation, there will be found, perhaps, as many more which it were advisable not to follow, I hope it will prove useful to some without being hurtful to any, and that my openness will find some favor with all. So again, he's just like sort of covering his ass. He's saying, I'm not teaching you, I could be wrong, I'm not sure. I don't want to say that this is what everyone should be doing. I'm just saying this is what works for me. right? So this is my method. Okay. From my childhood, I have been familiar with letters, and as I was given to believe that by their help a clear and certain knowledge of all that is useful in life may be acquired, I was ardently desirous of instruction. But as soon as I had finished the entire course of study, at the close of which it is customary to be admitted into the order of the learned, I completely changed my opinion. For I found myself involved in so many doubts and errors that I was convinced I had to advance no further in all my attempts at learning, at the discovery at every turn of my own ignorance. Or then the discovery at every turn of my own ignorance. And yet I was studying in one of the most celebrated schools in Europe, in which I thought there must be learned men, if such were to be found anywhere. I had been taught all that others learned there, and not contented with the sciences actually taught us. And not contented with the sciences actually taught us, I had, in addition, read all the books that had fallen into my hands, treating of such branches as are esteemed the most curious and rare. Right, so this is just him, this is biographical, right? He's saying, I grew up in, I was highly educated, basically. Say I was highly educated, and it wasn't good enough. I found that anything I learned was never enough, and a lot of it, maybe most of it, or maybe even all of it, was wrong, right? It seemed wrong. It didn't seem to make sense to me. And yet, if I was going to learn anything, and there was anybody worth listening to and worth learning from, it would have been here, right? Because this is one of the most celebrated schools in Europe. I knew the judgment which others had formed of me, and I did not find that I was considered inferior to my fellows, although there were among them some who were already marked out to fill the place of our instructors. And in fine, our age appeared to me as flourishing, and as fertile in powerful minds as any preceding one. I was thus led to take the liberty of judging of all other men by myself, and of concluding that there was no science in existence that was of such a nature as I had previously been given to believe. Right, so the idea there is, everybody around me seemed smart too, right? And we weren't living in an era where there shouldn't have been as many smart people around because, life was especially difficult or something, right? Things seemed fine, and people were, there was no reason to think that there aren't as many smart people around as usual. In fact, all my teachers had replacements lined up with very smart people who were at least as smart as them among the students, right? But nevertheless, I was unsatisfied, right? I wasn't satisfied. I didn't either, and he doesn't really say why he wasn't satisfied. It's either that it didn't make sense, or it wasn't enough, or there just seemed to be more that needed to be learned, or there was too much disagreement, or whatever. It's not clear, but for whatever reason, he was unsatisfied, and it didn't seem to be because of any fault of where he was studying or what he was learning. I still continued, however, to hold in esteem the studies of the schools. I was aware that the languages taught in them are necessary to the understanding of the writings of the ancients, that the grace of fable stirs the mind, that the memorable deeds of history elevate it, and, if read with discretion, aid in forming the judgment, that the perusal of all excellent books is, as it were, to interview with the noblest men of past ages who have written them, and even a studied interview in which are discovered to us only their choicest thoughts. That eloquence had incomparable force and beauty, that poesy, that means poetry, had its ravishing graces and delights, that in mathematics there are many refined discoveries eminently suited to gratify the inquisitive, as well as further all the arts and lessen the labor of men. So he's saying, this is just him talking about how great everything he learned actually was, even though he wasn't satisfied with it, right? He's saying, look, no, I get all that's good from that, from the stuff that I learned, right? I appreciate that stuff, and here's all the details, right? History, that's good. Poetry, art, mathematics, right? That's all good. That numerously highly useful precepts and exhortations to virtue are contained in treatises on morals, that theology points out the path to heaven, that philosophy affords the meaning of discoursing with an appearance of truth on all matters, and commands the admiration of the more simple. Oh, okay, so a little jab there. That a lot of philosophers are simple. That jurisprudence, medicine, and the other sciences secure for their cultivators honors and riches, and in fine, that it is useful to bestow some attention upon all, even upon those abounding the most in superstition and error, that we may be in a position to determine their real value and guard against being deceived. So, again, the idea there is that, look, even though I'm like coming down hard on all this stuff that I learned growing up, it's still valuable, right? I don't deny its value. It's clearly important, and you gotta learn it. You gotta learn it, just like I did. Okay. But I believe that I had already given sufficient time to languages, and likewise to the readings of the writings of the ancients, to their histories and fables. For to hold converse with those of other ages and to travel are almost the same thing. Now that's interesting. So Descartes is a fan of traveling. To hold converse with those of other ages and to travel are almost the same thing. I'm going to highlight that. Good one. There it is. Okay. It is useful to know something of the manners of different nations, that we may be enabled to form a more correct judgment regarding our own, and be prevented from thinking that everything contrary to our custom is ridiculous and irrational, a conclusion usually come to by those whose experience has been limited to their own country. Well, that's interesting, right? So he's saying that we really ought to travel, go out and see the world. And the more you do that, the less you'll think that your way of living is best, or that all other ways of living are irrational, right? So he's kind of like, encouraging people to go out and see the world so they don't get all, closed-minded and stuck to their own ways. On the other hand, when too much time is occupied traveling, we become strangers to our native country, and the over-curious in the customs of the past are generally ignorant of those of the present. Besides, fictitious narratives lead us to imagine the possibility of many events that are impossible, and even the most faithful histories, if they do not wholly misrepresent matters, or exaggerate their importance to render the account of them more worthy of perusal, omit, at least, almost always the meanest and least striking of the attendant circumstances. Hence, it happens that the remainder does not represent the truth, and that such as regulate their conduct by examples drawn from this source are apt to fall into the extravagances of the knight-errants of romance, and to entertain projects that exceed their powers. Okay. So he's giving this analogy between traveling and studying the past, right? Studying history. He thinks that like going somewhere to learn about it physically is very similar to going to the past and learning about it through reading history, right? And he's in this second part here, he's talking basically about like sampling bias, right? Where he's saying that, when you read a history book, it's going to be biased, right? It's not going to focus on everything. It's not going to give you the full picture. It's going to be written to encourage readership, obviously, right? And so it's not perfect. It gives you an imperfect impression of the situation, and that's inherent whenever we read anything from history. Okay. I esteemed eloquence highly, and was in raptures with poetry. But I thought that both were gifts of nature rather than fruits of study. Those in whom the faculty of reason is predominant, and who most skillfully dispose their thoughts with a view to render them clear and intelligible, are always the best able to persuade others of the truth of what they lay down, though they should speak only in the language of Lower Brittany, and be wholly ignorant of the rules of rhetoric. So again, I think language of Lower Brittany. I'm pretty sure this is like a swipe at the British or swipe at the English. I'm pretty sure this is like a classic French, French and English rivalry sort of jab there. Right? So the idea is that like, I know how rhetoric works, and it even works for people who don't speak French. And those whose minds are stored with the most agreeable fancies, and who can give expression to them with the greatest embellishment and harmony, are still the best poets, though unacquainted with the art of poetry. Okay. So poesy, I think what he means by this is also rhetoric, right? Not just poetry, but rhetoric, right? So the ability to persuade people, right? What we would call persuasion, right? So persuasion tactics. He's talking about those. He says, being persuasive and eloquent, that's all good too, right? But maybe it's not the full picture, right? So he's talking about the good things from his his impression of the good elements of the various sciences that he's learned, right? So eloquence is very important. History is very important, even though it's a bit, imperfect. And now he goes on to mathematics, right? I was especially delighted with the mathematics on account of the certitude and the evidence of their reasoning. But I had not as yet a precise knowledge of their true use. And thinking that they but contributed to the advancement of mechanical arts, I was astonished that foundations, so strong and solid, should have had no loftier superstructure reared on them. On the other hand, I compared the disquisitions of the ancient moralists to very towering and magnificent palaces with no better foundation than sand and mud. They laud the virtues very highly and exhibit them as estimable far above anything on earth. But they gave us no adequate criterion of virtue, and frequently that which they designate with so fine a name, but apathy, or pride, or despair, or parricide. Okay. So this kind of sets up a couple themes in Descartes that we'll see time and time again. Right, so one thing, a guy loves math, right? He loves math, and by math he also means things like geometry as well. And the idea is that, like, when he learned foundations of math, right, mathematics, physics, presumably, right, as well, he was very impressed because in mathematics you have proofs, and in geometry you have proofs, where they you have a couple simple axioms, and then you go on to prove more complex equations and complex consequences, right? And he's very impressed with that, but he was astonished that the foundations, right, that mathematics that's like built on this structure where like, P must follow from Q or whatever, right? Where one proposition must follow from another with absolute certitude, right? So 1 + 1 = 2, right? 2 just follows from 1 + 1 every single time. There's no doubt. That's just the way it works, right? That's just a mathematical truth. And he says, well, why isn't that what sort of runs the world, right? Why doesn't mathematical certainty and the methods of mathematics and geometry, why doesn't axiomatical reasoning run the world, right? Instead, it seems like the foundations of sciences are much shakier, right? It's much shakier. We don't use axiomatic reasoning to do very much, actually. And he found that kind of disappointing, right? And then on the other hand, he thinks that a lot of moral philosophy, and by this he means things like probably like the ethics of Thomas Aquinas, right, and other pre-modern thinkers, where he says that those discussions of the various virtues don't have a very solid foundation, right? Those are not axiomatic, and furthermore, they don't really accord with common sense, right? Frequently that of which they designate which so fine a name, namely virtue, is but apathy or pride or despair or parasite, right? So not only is there not a very strong foundation for moral philosophy or ethics, but also very frequently people will arrive at things that don't even make sense. That's the worry. Okay, so he likes math, and he hasn't said anything nice about philosophy yet. I revered our theology and aspired as much as anyone to reach heaven, but being given assuredly to understand that the way is not less open to the most ignorant than to the most learned, and that the revealed truths which lead to heaven are above our comprehension, I did not presume to subject them to the impotency of my reason. And I thought that in order to competently undertake their examination, there was need of some special help from heaven and of being more than man. So what he's saying here is that when he studied theology, it was kind of weird to realize that, you didn't need to study theology to go to heaven, right? You just need to be like a good person and follow, the Christian rules or whatever and accept the right truths, right? And that like even a church-going, pious peasant could make it to heaven. You didn't have to study theology to make it to heaven. So, like, what's the point? Right? What's the point? On the other hand, like, if you really want to understand theology, you have to be, superhuman, basically. Right? You have to be superhuman. Truths which lead to heaven that are above comprehension. Right? And I wasn't going to do that. Right, I wasn't going to do that. That didn't seem necessary, especially since the standards for getting into heaven are much lower than spending all your time thinking about theology. Okay, so he thought theology was good, but I don't not super convinced. Right, I thought that in order to competently undertake their examination, right, namely theology, there was need of some special help from heaven and of being more than man, right? So we thought, maybe it's not for me. I guess that's what I take out of this paragraph. Of philosophy, I will say nothing, except that when I saw that it had been cultivated for many ages by the most distinguished men, and yet that there is not a single matter within its sphere which is not still in dispute, and nothing, therefore, which is above doubt, I did not presume to anticipate that my success would be greater in it than that of others. And further, when I considered the number of conflicting opinions touching a single matter that may be upheld by learned men, while there can be but one true, I reckoned as well nigh false all that was only probable. Okay, this piece really needs decoding, so bear with me, right? So he doesn't want to say much about philosophy, but he's going to, right? Because he's a philosopher. But he'll say that, even though people have been studying philosophy like forever, for many ages, there's nothing within the topic of philosophy that is not still in dispute, right? Like everybody still disagrees about even the most basic questions, right? Even though philosophy is very old. And he's saying this in the 1600s, right? And we clearly haven't made much progress since then. But he's saying it back then. And he said, I also didn't expect that my success would be greater in philosophy than in other areas of science, right? So he's kind of like surprised that his philosophy is like what he's best known for. So like Cartesianism like became one of the dominant schools of thought in that time period, right? So Spinoza, the great philosopher, was a Cartesian, right? A follower of Cartesianism, as were many others. Although, Spinoza, of course, did his own thing, but mostly associated with the Cartesian school of thought when people talk about him, right? So he was kind of surprised that he had that influence, even though philosophy is such a mess and has been for thousands of years. And then this last sentence, which is a mouthful, is about basically his method of doubt. And this is what he's going to get into this, I think, in the next part, right? And further, when I considered the number of conflicting opinions touching a single matter that may be upheld by learned men, while there can be but one true, I reckoned as well nigh false all that was only probable, right? So So he says, when I looked around and saw that like people are debating things where there's clearly just one right answer, even though very learned and intelligent people disagree about it, the best thing to do is to just consider everything false unless you're absolutely certain of it, right? Right? Everything that is only probable, I'm going to consider it false, right? So things that are only probably true, I'm just going to treat those as false. That's what he's saying here. Right? And this is like the core of his epistemology, or this is like the beginning of it. This is like a cliff note, or a sign of things to come, foreshadowing, right? Or signposting, if you will. Okay. As to the other sciences, inasmuch as these borrow their principles from philosophy, I judge that no solid superstructures could be reared on foundations so infirm, and neither the honor nor gain held out by them was sufficient to determine me to their cultivation. For I was not, thank heaven, in a condition which compelled me to make merchandise of science for the bettering of my fortune, and though I might not profess to scorn glory as a cynic, I yet made very slight account of that honor which I hoped to acquire only through fictitious titles. So this is like kind of his, he's saying like, and I wasn't really focused on other things because I wasn't really concerned about like getting rich or famous or whatever. That's what he's saying here. And in fine, of false sciences, I thought I knew the worth sufficiently to escape being deceived by the professions of an alchemist, the predictions of an astrologer, the impostures of a magician, or by the artifacts and boasting of any of those who profess to know things of which they are ignorant, right? So he's also like dismissive of sciences, quote unquote, that seem very rigorous, right? They seem to be very promising, and they make predictions and they make claims with confidence, but he's just not convinced. Because he's not convinced, he's not interested. For these reasons, as soon as my age permitted me to pass from under the control of my instructors, I entirely abandoned the study of letters. I quit school, or as soon as I could get out of school, I was done with it. Right, and that's it. And resolved no longer to seek any other science than the knowledge of myself, or of the great book of the world. Right, so that like at a certain point, I just didn't really want to study sciences as such anymore and read books directly anymore. I just wanted to learn about myself and my own reasoning and my own processes, right? I wanted to learn about reason itself, and I wanted to study the great book of the world, right? Meaning I wanted to go out and learn things about the world. And we'll see this, I'll make this point later on, but there's a misconception about Descartes that gets associated with his philosophy. But I do want to drive home the point, and we'll return to it later. But he's very interested in learning about the world, right? And learning things and doing experiments and learning how things work, how stuff works, right? He's very interested in that. So I spent the remainder of my youth in traveling, in visiting courts and armies, in holding intercourse with men of different dispositions and rank. It doesn't mean what you might think it means, right? It just means engaging or interacting with other people, right? And talking to as many people as possible. In collecting varied experience, in proving myself in different situations into which fortune threw me, and above all, in making such reflection on the matter of my experience as to secure my improvement, right? So he reached a point where he just went out in the world and wanted to learn things, learn from other people, travel places, see the world, and constantly be reflecting on his own experiences, his own use of reason, and his own improvement, right? He wanted to improve. For it occurred to me that I should find much more truth in the reasonings of each individual with reference to the affairs in which he is personally interested, and the issues of which must presently punish him if he has judged amiss, than in those conducted by men of letters in his study regarding speculative matters that are of no practical moment and followed by no consequences to himself, farther perhaps than that they foster his vanity to be better. Farther perhaps than that they foster his vanity, the better, the more remote they are from common sense. Right, so what that means is that he's basically saying, I wanted to go out and see the world and see how like normal, regular people and people who like function in society think about things and engage with others and solve problems and deal with stuff that actually affects them. That stuff was much more interesting to me than like people solving logic puzzles and, you know, writing about, you know, philosophy or whatever, right? By the things, you know, speculative musings by men of letters, right? That fostered vanity, right? They don't do anything, and this is it, right? They, you know, regarding speculative matters that are of no practical moment and followed by no consequences to himself, farther perhaps than that they foster his vanity, the better, the more remote they are from common sense, right? Meaning, you know, maybe people think more highly of themselves if their logic puzzles are more abstract and remote and weird, right? So, yeah. Requiring, as they must in this case, the exercise of greater ingenuity and art to render them probable, right? So the idea is that, like, yeah, you know, if you, you know, the fancier and more difficult and complex and abstract your philosophy is, you might feel cooler, right? Because it's more difficult. It's not more practical. It doesn't matter more than, like, you know, how do we make this building so it doesn't come crashing down on people inside of it in another 15 years, right? Like, how do we solve this irrigation problem? How do we rebuild a city so it doesn't like collapse? Right? Those kind of problems. Or like, how do we solve this dispute between these two different factions so they don't start killing each other, right? Those kinds of problem solving opportunities are much more interesting to Descartes than, like, you know, trying to decide about, like, you know, the problem of evil or something, right? Like, you know, why would, or any other like classic philosophical problem. Descartes was like, none of that stuff really matters. At least it didn't matter to me at this point. So again, like, he gets this like reputation of being the guy in the bathrobe, you know, meditating about these abstract things and proving the existence of God from his you know, in front of the fireplace or whatever, and doing all this abstract metaphysics-y philosophical stuff. But he really like wasn't all that into that stuff for a lot of his life. He was out in the world doing stuff. I mean, the guy was nuts, really. In addition, I had always a most earnest desire to know how to distinguish the true from the false, in order that I might be able to clearly discriminate the right path in life and proceed in it with confidence. Right? And this is important too, right? Because it also emphasizes this point that, you know, Descartes, you know, the reason to study philosophy for him, as for many great philosophers, including the ones we've talked about on this channel, like Bertrand Russell, that was my first video, and Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher, right? The goal is to use philosophy and study philosophy. Why? To be a better person, right? That's the goal, to be a better person, to clearly distinguish or to clearly discriminate the right path in life. That's why we want to know what's true and what's false, so we can be a good person. Right? And here it is, Descartes saying that, right? It's not just to like solve logic puzzles and get a job and, you know, publish papers or whatever. Like, that's not it. The point is to figure out the right path in life and to proceed with confidence. It is true that while busied only in considering the manners of other men, I found here too scarce any ground for settled conviction, and remarked hardly less contradiction among them than in the opinions of the philosophers. Right, so he went out and saw the world, and he realized that even out in the world, everybody disagrees. Right? It's not just philosophers, it's not just in the academy that people disagree. They just disagree about different stuff, right? Because out there in the world, there's contradictions everywhere. People are always disagreeing with one another, right? So that the greatest advantage I derived from this study consisted in this, that observing many things which, however extravagant and ridiculous to our apprehension, are yet by common consent received and approved by other great nations, I learned to entertain too decided a belief in regarding nothing of the truth of which I had been persuaded merely by example and custom. One sentence, by the way. It's one, two, three, four, five, six lines. These are really long sentences. That's why I'm getting a little tongue-tied. Apologies, right? So upon going out in the world and learning about all the different ways that people do things, he decided not to believe anything as true, merely because it had been taught to him, or because it was custom, or because it was given to him as an example, right? So don't believe any of that stuff. He came to this conclusion, right? And thus I gradually extricated myself from many errors powerful enough to darken our natural intelligence and incapacitate us in great measure from listening to reason. Because again, the idea is that we grow up in our own little worlds, and as a result, we end up believing lots of things that are just totally false. Right? We end up believing lots of things that are false, that are contrary to reason, that don't make sense, that are contradictions. We don't believe what's in front of our own eyes, and we're worse off for it. And Descartes says when you go out in the world and explore and learn, you don't make those mistakes anymore because you don't believe your own nonsense so easily, right? You don't just rely on custom and what you were taught growing up. You learn that other people learn different things when they were growing up, and that maybe you shouldn't take your own customs so seriously, right? And eventually, after learning all this stuff and exploring the world, eventually he started to make some progress, he says. But after I had been occupied several years in thus studying the book of the world and in essays to gather some experience, I at length resolved to make myself an object of study and to employ all my powers, or all the powers of my mind, in choosing the paths I ought to follow, an undertaking which was accompanied with great success, or greater success, than it would have been had I never quitted my country or my books. Okay, so now he's saying, after studying the book of the world, which means going out and traveling and seeing things, then he came back and said, okay, now I'm ready to form my opinion and study myself and how I'm processing all this, how I used to process things, how do I understand the process of processing information as a human being. And I have so much knowledge. I have all this knowledge from the books. I have all this knowledge from traveling. I've seen so much stuff. I've done so much stuff. And I'm going to try and put all that together and find the common denominator and write it all down for you. That's the idea. And he says, this was only successful because I stopped reading, because I quit learning in the old-fashioned way, and I learned by traveling and seeing the world, and seeing the way that different people live, watching different people solve problems, and things like that. Yeah. Okay. So, need both, right? You can't just keep your nose in the books all the time. You have to go out and see the world, according to Descartes. Okay, so that's part one. That is part one. Yeah, some good stuff in there, right? He's just giving you a little background. He did a lot of studying when he was younger, and then he stopped and went around and traveled the world, and now he's ready to put all of his knowledge and understanding in the form of a method that he thinks is reliable for understanding the world. So here's part two. Well, let me get a drink first. Okay. Part two. I was then in Germany, attracted thither by the wars in that country, which have not yet been brought to a termination. And as I was returning to the army from the coronation of the emperor, the setting in of winter arrested me in a locality where, as I found no society to interest me, and was besides fortunately undisturbed by any cares or passions, I remained the whole day in seclusion, with full opportunity to occupy my attention with my own thoughts. So, picture, right? He moved to Germany, to go fight in a war for fun, I guess. He was a mercenary. And after the emperor, some emperor, I don't know who, was coronated, he went home, and it was winter, so there was not much to do. It was dark and cold, and he was bored because he was in the middle of nowhere, right? There was no society to interest him, right? There were no museums. This wasn't like Vienna or something, right? He was in the middle of nowhere, and he got the day to himself. Just I don't know if it was just one day or maybe more, but regardless, this day stands out where he was just able to really just do nothing but think, and just think about his thoughts and just occupy his attention with his own thoughts. So that's what he did for a day, right? Okay, what'd you learn there, Descartes? Of these, one of the very first that occurred to me was that there is seldom so much perfection in works composed of many separate parts, upon which different hands had thus been employed, and in those completed by a single master. Okay? So, composite works are less perfect than things that are designed from start to finish by one person. Okay? Thus, it is observable that the buildings which a single architect has planned and executed are generally more elegant and commodious than those which several have attempted to improve, by making old walls serve for purposes for which they were not originally built. Okay? Alright, so central planning in architecture is better. Let's see what follows from that. Thus also those ancient cities which, from being at first only villages, have become, in course of time, large towns, are usually but ill laid out compared with the regularity constructed. Sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied here. These sentences are really long. Thus also those ancient cities which, from being at first only villages, have become, in course of time, large towns, are usually but ill laid out compared with the regularity constructed towns which a professional architect has freely planned on an open plain. So again, right, cities that grow over time, like ancient cities, like a Rome or something, not nearly as sensible as modern planned urban planning, right, with a single vision that's put into practice. So that although the several buildings of the former may often equal or surpass in beauty those of the latter, yet when one observes their indiscriminate juxtaposition, there a large one and here a small, and the consequent crookedness and irregularity of the streets, one is disposed to allege that chance, rather than any human will guided by reason, must have led to such an arrangement. Right, so you could clearly tell the difference between a place that was designed and a place that was just sort of randomly assembled over a period of time where, there was sort of natural growth in the city's population and different changes and renovations of different buildings over the years, right? You can tell the difference between, a Rome kind of city and a place that was centrally planned and well thought out. I don't know, maybe a Singapore, right? Or certain areas in a Singapore. And if we consider, nevertheless, that there have been at all times certain officers whose duty it was to see that private buildings contributed to public ornament, the difficulty of reaching high perfection with but the materials of others to operate on will be regularly acknowledged. Let's just keep reading. In the same way, I fancied that those nations which, starting from a semi-barbarous state and advancing to civilization by slow degrees, have had their laws successively determined and, as it were, forced upon them simply by experience of the hurtfulness of particular crimes and disputes, would by this process come to be possessed of less perfect institutions than those which, from the commencement of their association as communities, have followed the appointments of some wise legislator. Okay, so first it's this analogy with city planning, saying, look, it's obviously better. Well, first he starts with buildings, right? He starts an architecture, right? An architect builds something from scratch. It's one design, it's one vision, and that gets built, and that's much better than a hodgepodge assemblage of, one person puts a wall there, one person puts another wall there, they use different materials, it's a mess, right? Things like that. Expand that out to city planning, right? A centrally planned city usually makes much more sense than a randomly cobbled together one, right? And now on to the level of the state, right? It's much better to have maybe a constitution rather than a common law system. I don't know if this is also like a jab at the French, or a jab at the English again, which had a common law system, as opposed to like a constitution or some legal code that sets everything out all at once and is much more well organized than just determining the laws like as time goes on, and not really in any fixed codified fashion. Okay, that's the analogy. Now where are we going with this? It is thus quite certain that the constitution of the true religion, that's where we're going, Christianity, the ordinances of which are derived from God, must be incomparably superior to that of every other. Okay, so now it's like, okay, here's the Christianity stuff, here's the God stuff, here you go, right? And to speak of human affairs, I believe that the preeminence of Sparta, which was the ancient Greek city-state, was due not to the goodness of each of its laws in particular, for many of these were very strange and even opposed to good morals, but to the circumstance that, originated by a single individual, they all tended to a single end. Okay, so this is a point that he kind of returns to in part 3, where the idea is that, look, as long as you're focused on one thing and you have like a guiding, organized method, then like the individual parts not being perfect isn't really a big deal. Right? It's not a huge deal that each of the individual pieces of your system, whatever it is, whether it's philosophy or a legal system or whatever, those can afford to be like less than perfect along the way, as long as you keep your eye on the prize, right? As long as you have an overall goal, right? A focus, right? The laws of Sparta were originated by a single individual, and they all tended to a single end, right? And that's what made the laws of Sparta great. And you can. Yeah, so like this is a point of reference that most people would have gotten back then, but Sparta was this very ascetic. Well, I don't know, maybe ascetic's not the right word, but it's Spartan. If you ever heard that adjective, but they lived a very harsh and rigorous life, and they had very strange customs about that was. Very strict and always prepared for war. If you've ever seen Zack Snyder's The 300, it's not super historically accurate, but it's it sort of captures just how unique Spartan culture was and how legendary it was, right? So I think even Herodotus writes about Sparta and the Battle of Thermopylae in The 300. I'm pretty sure that's it. Don't quote me on that. But anyway, right, the idea was that even though Sparta was full of a bunch of weirdos and all the laws were kind of strange, or a lot of the laws were kind of strange, and we might even say like crazy, because they were all systematized in this way and brought about for a single end, that's why they were so well respected and well regarded and famous and successful, because people look back on Sparta as unique but also successful in many respects, right? Admirable. In the same way, I thought that the sciences contained in books, such of them at least as are made up of probable reasonings without demonstrations, right, composed as they are of the opinions of many different individuals massed together, are farther removed from the truth than the simple inferences which a man of good sense, using his natural and unprejudiced judgment, draws respecting the matters of his experience. Okay, so now he's going back to the sciences. In the same way, right, all the different bits of knowledge sort of cobbled together randomly in all the different works of science and philosophy and whatever, those are all sort of much further from the truth than simple inferences which anyone could follow through to the truth, right? So that's like kind of bold, but again, it's this analogy where like a central, focused, organized, unitary focus is much better than a bunch of stuff randomly cobbled together. I don't think we agree with this nowadays, but that's the argument. And because we have all to pass through a state of infancy to manhood, and have been of necessity for a length of time governed by our desires and preceptors, whose dictates were frequently conflicting, while neither perhaps always counseled us for the best, I farther concluded that it is almost impossible that our judgments can be so correct or solid as they would have been had our reason been mature from the moment of our birth, and had we always been guided by it alone. The idea being here that we are necessarily imperfect in our use of reason because we are taught things from when we are very young that do not reflect our reason, that are irrational, for lack of a better term, right? Things that are wrong, that are false, and we don't know any better because we don't yet know how to use our reason. So, right, so there's a lot of junk, right? By the time that we're smart enough to understand how to think rationally, we've already accumulated a lot of junk that is, that we believe, that's part of all the beliefs that we have, but isn't actually justifiable by reason, right? That doesn't actually follow from some basic principles that we know to be true, right? All the things that I know to be true for certain can't justify a bunch of stuff that I claim to know that I was taught throughout my life. It is true, however, that it is not customary to pull down all the houses of a town with a single design of rebuilding them differently, and thereby rendering the streets more handsome. But it often happens that a private individual takes down his own with the view of erecting it anew, and that people are even sometimes constrained to this when their houses are in danger of falling from age, or when the foundations are insecure, right? So, nevertheless, if we want to rebuild a town to make it more sensible, we don't, rip down all the houses at once. Usually, some houses are rebuilt because they're falling apart, or they're very old, or somebody just wants to renovate their home, right? This is a piecemeal process, basically, usually, right? With this before me by way of example, I was persuaded that it would indeed be preposterous for a private individual to think of reforming a state by fundamentally changing it throughout and overturning it in order to set it up amended. And the same I thought was true of any similar project for reforming a body of the sciences, or the order of teaching them established in the schools. Right, so he sort of, even though he says, it would be better if there was, some central planning or some overarching goal or some general approach or standard or plan that could guide the use of reason and science and our understanding of things, right? That would be great, but usually this is not like a one fell swoop kind of ordeal, right? Whenever we want to rebuild or improve something that's like kind of a mess, we can't really expect to do it all at once. Even Descartes has to admit that. At least in these practical examples, right? For like trying to recreate a curriculum, right? When he says of reforming the body of the sciences or the order of teaching them, right? That's not going to be done like all at once, right? That's going to take some time. But as for the opinions which up to that time I had embraced, I thought that I could not do better than to resolve at once to sweep them wholly away, that I might afterwards be in a position to admit either others more correct or even perhaps the same when they had undergone the scrutiny of reason. So he says, even though all that stuff is true for like reforming a curriculum or rebuilding a town or recreating a legal system, right, which is not very practical, when it comes to me sort of reimagining my own beliefs and going through and deciding what's the stuff I should believe and what's the stuff I should kick, that has to be done all at once, right? There's nothing to that's a less messy process. That I can do all at once. I can just sweep away everything and start from scratch. I firmly believed that in this way I should much better succeed in the conduct of my life than if I built upon only the old foundations and leaned upon principles which in my youth I had taken upon trust. For although I recognize various difficulties in this undertaking, these were not, however, without remedy, nor once to be compared with such as attend the slightest reformation in public affairs. Right. So again, he's saying, in order to reconstruct my beliefs and only believe things that are true, I sort of need to start from scratch. I need a new foundation because I can't rely on the stuff that I just learned when I was a kid and that I just believed because my parents told me or my teachers told me or whatever, right? And this is way different from anything that involves, reforming public affairs, right? Like the examples he gave above, like renovating a building or reforming a law code or whatever. Large bodies, if once overthrown, are with great difficulty set up again, or even kept erect when once seriously shaken, and the fall of such is always disastrous. Right? So, like, this is why this doesn't work in real life, because if you like say, "Oh, I'm gonna totally, we're gonna start a new constitution, or we're gonna have a revolution and set up a new legal system all at once," usually it's a disaster. Descartes saying. Then, if there are any imperfections in the constitutions of states, and that many such exist, the diversity of constitutions is alone sufficient to assure us. Custom has, without doubt, materially smoothed their inconveniences, and has even managed to steer altogether clear of, or insensibly corrected, a number which sagacity could not have provided against with equal effect. That's interesting. So he's saying that, and if you, even in cases where there were constitutions set up and we started from scratch, if there were any mistakes in that constitution, in the legal system, the fact that people have customs that step in and sort of guide human life reliably on their own, that's, where custom has a role of providing continuity and safety in periods of transition and upheaval, right? So that's what he's saying. So it's kind of like a sociological observation that, look, even if you had the most perfect legal system, if you were to just set it up in a mess of a situation, like a state in disarray, First of all, there would be inherent problems because just doing that is going to screw people over and screw things up. And second of all, no constitution is going to be perfect, so there's going to be problems with it, and therefore there's going to be like some reliance on just the normal customs of people to sort of maintain regularity and keep things from totally going off the rails. Yeah. And in fine, the defects are almost always more tolerable than the change necessary for their removal. Oh, that's nice. Right, so a lot of times, I guess he's saying that, well, even if things aren't perfect, it's much better than the alternative, which would require something like totally crazy, or which would, if you were to completely replace a legal system or any sort of system that's widely practiced or adopted by large groups of people, it's much easier to just sort of work with what you have than to set up something new, which would be a disaster, usually. In the same manner that highways, which wind among mountains, by being much frequented, become gradually so smooth and commodious that it is much better to follow them than to seek a straight path by climbing over the tops of rocks and descending to the bottoms of precipices. Right, so there you go. There's a nice analogy. Right, so customary following of highways through the mountains and trails being worn down over time by being those most followed and most amenable to human traffic over time, even if they're not a perfectly straight line, it's the better way to go because of how many people have trodden those paths. Okay, so now I feel like we're kind of like way off topic, and this was like a super long paragraph, but what he did, what's written. So where are we going? Where are we going with all this, Descartes? Hence it is that I cannot in any degree approve of those restless and busy meddlers who, called neither by birth nor fortune to take part in the management of public affairs, are yet always projecting reforms. Okay, so we're still off topic. Fine. I guess this is just his rant against reformers or revolutionaries. And if I thought that this tract contained aught which might justify the suspicion that I was a victim of such folly, I would by no means permit its publication. Okay. No, we are back on track. Okay. What he's saying here is that, I hate reformers and people saying that, we need to usher in the revolution and overthrow the government and set up something new. He doesn't like that at all. He's not a fan of that. He doesn't think it works in the public sphere. And if he thought that he was doing that by promoting the same thing in the domain of, your beliefs or your knowledge, he wouldn't be writing this, right? He doesn't think that that's what he's doing. It's what he's doing, but because it's applied to a different topic, namely of trying to understand and reform our beliefs about the world and arrive at more true beliefs than false beliefs, because it's applied to that project, it's not subject to the same scrutiny that would a normal call for revolution in a public setting. I have never contemplated anything higher than the reformation of my own opinions, and basing them on a foundation wholly my own. And although my own satisfaction with my work has led me to present here a draft of it, I do not by any means therefore recommend to everyone else to make a similar attempt. Okay, again, so he's saying when I was doing this, I had to start from scratch. I had to sweep everything out. I just had to all this stuff that I believed, I just couldn't believe it anymore. I had to get rid of it and start over. If that sounds kind of revolutionary, sorry, that's not really what I'm going for. And by the way, I'm not saying that everyone should do this. I'm just, once again, so he's reminding, I'm just saying this is what works for me, right? I'm not recommending that everyone do this. Those whom God has endowed with a larger measure of genius will entertain, perhaps, designs still more exalted. Right? So smarter people might come up with something else. But for the many, I am much afraid lest even the present undertaking be more than they can safely venture to imitate, right? So, maybe some really, really smart people will say, like, no, you should do this other thing that's even more demanding. But even this, I think, is going to be a lot for most people. So he is saying, brace yourselves. Like, this is not easy. This is not for the faint of heart. This is a lot of work, and this is very difficult. The single design to strip oneself of all past beliefs is one that ought not be taken by everyone. The majority of men is composed of two classes, for neither of which would this be at all a befitting resolution. In the first place, the majority of men is composed of two classes, for neither of which this be at all a befitting resolution, right? So most people fall into two categories. And he's talking to the minority, who's neither of these two categories. But he's talking about the two categories that make up the majority of people. In the first place, of those who with more than a due confidence in their own powers are precipitate in their judgments and want the patience requisite for orderly and circumspect thinking. Right? So people who are opinionated and don't think, and impatient, and are confident that they know it all already. Whence it happens that if men of this class once take the liberty to doubt of their accustomed opinions and quit the beaten highway, they will never be able to thread the byway that would lead them by a shorter course, and will lose themselves and continue to wander for life. Right? So basically, like, if somebody is really sure of themselves and doesn't have any doubt about anything that they know, and then suddenly question everything, it's going to be a psychological disaster for them, right? They won't be able to function. They'll just they'll lose themselves and continue to wander for life, right? So it'll be a psychological disaster for people who are confident and assured of themselves, but not very confident and sure of themselves, to suddenly start questioning everything. It would be a disaster for them. In the second place, of those who, possessed of sufficient sense or modesty to determine that there are others who will excel them in the power of discriminating between truth and error, and by whom they may be instructed, ought rather to content themselves with the opinions of such than trust for more correct to their own reason. Okay, that one I gotta read that. In the second place, of those who possessed of sufficient sense or modesty to determine that there are others who excel them in the power of discriminating between truth and error, and by whom they may be instructed, ought rather to content themselves with the opinions of such than trust for more correct to their own reason. The other group of people are those who do trust others and who are confident in their ability to identify people who are smarter than them and who are trustworthy. Those people don't bother with this, right? Don't bother with what we're about to do here. Just, listen to your teachers. If that's good enough for you, if you're sufficiently curious to not think that you know everything, and you're sort of smart enough to accept that some people are smarter than you and you should learn from them, just keep doing that. Just keep doing that. Don't bother with this, right? So you have the arrogant sort of the arrogant know-it-all type who doesn't think very much or doesn't think with much modesty, and then you have the types who are modest and accept that there are people smarter than them who they can learn from. So those are the two types that comprise the majority of people, according to Descartes. And neither of them should do what he's done. Right? Neither of them should follow this path. Okay? For my own part, I should doubtless have belonged to the latter class, had I received instruction from but one master, or had I never known the diversities of opinion that from time immemorial have prevailed among men of the greatest learning. Right? So I would definitely, so Descartes saying I was not one of the know-it-all types who thought that I knew everything. I definitely like respected my teachers and thought that I could learn from them. But the fact is that I learned so much from so many different people that I very quickly realized that like nobody knows what they're talking about, and that most of them are wrong, right? Even like the smartest people, like they disagree with each other. So if the smartest people disagree with each other, then like we kind of have no hope, right? Like how can anyone say that they know anything if like the people who spend their whole lives learning about stuff can't agree on even like the most basic things, right? So that's why he's no longer in that second camp, right? But I had become aware, even so during my college life, or even so early as during my college life, that no opinion, however absurd and incredible, can be imagined which has not been maintained by some of the philosophers. I'm wondering if there are just typos in this file, right? Like I wonder if maybe that's why I'm getting tongue-tied too. Maybe they're just like on here. Like I don't think on belongs here. It's not grammatical. So maybe it's not entirely my fault, but probably is. But anyway, right? There's nothing new under the sun, right? That's basically what's being said here, right? No opinion, however absurd, can be imagined which hasn't already been maintained by some philosopher. Right? So everything crazy you could think of, somebody's already thought of it, right? Descartes saying this in like 1630 or whatever, right? And afterwards, in the course of my travels, I remarked that all those whose opinions are decidedly repugnant to ours are not, in that account, barbarians and savages, but on the contrary, that many of these nations make an equally good, if not better, use of their reason than we do. Right? So just because people disagree, it doesn't mean that they're crazy or barbarians, right? Because I've seen people who disagree about even basic stuff, and they seem like totally normal and decent people. So that's weird, right? I took into account also the very different character which a person brought up from infancy in France or Germany exhibits, from that which, with the same mind originally, this individual would have possessed had he lived always among the Chinese or with savages, and the circumstance that in dress itself the fashion which pleased us 10 years ago, and which may again, perhaps, be received into favor before 10 years have gone, appears to us at this moment extravagant and ridiculous. Right, so now he's talking about like, he's saying that, you know, people who were brought up in France and Germany, right, are very different from people who were brought up in China, right? Even though we're all human beings, right? We're all people with the faculty of reason, right? And nurture, right? Our customs make us different. And these customs vary tremendously, right? Like from one country to another, and also from one era to another, right? From 10 years ago, the fashion is very different from what it is now, and in another 10 years, it'll be very different. And he's talking, directly about fashion, right? I was thus led to infer that the ground of our opinions is far more custom and example than any certain knowledge. Right? So most of our opinions come from custom, not from the rigorous application of reason. And that is really what we're after, right? But that's not what most of us believe. Most of us believe whatever we're taught. Right? And finally, although such be the grounds of our opinions, I remarked that a plurality of suffrages is no guarantee of truth, where it is at all of difficult discovery, as in such cases it is much more likely that it will be found by one than by many. I don't know what that really means. I could, however, select from the crowd no one whose opinion seemed worthy of preference, and thus I found myself constrained, as it were, to use my own reason in the conduct of my life. Okay, yeah, so basically, so he's denying that, even if there's widespread agreement about something, especially if it's something difficult, then that's not a good reason to accept it as true, right? Just because people believe it. And finally, he didn't. There was nobody who seemed to stand out in his life as uniquely trustworthy, who knew everything, who understood everything, and so on. That could be used as his one teacher that he could trust forever. So instead, he just had to sort of rely on his own reason. Right? He was left not able to trust anything else in the world because of the diversity of opinions and his experience with different customs and people in different places. And he, so he came to the conclusion that, well, I just have to rely on myself. I have to learn how to use my reason the right way and go from there. But like one walking alone and in the dark, I resolved to proceed so slowly and with such circumspection that if I did not advance far, I would at least guard against falling. I did not even choose to dismiss summarily any of the opinions that had crept into my belief without having been introduced by reason, but first of all took sufficient time carefully to satisfy myself of the general nature of the task I was setting myself, and ascertain the true method by which to arrive at the knowledge of whatever lay within the compass of my powers. Right, so he said, basically, this is going to be a slow process. This is going to be a tricky process. I had to really get a sense of what I'm going to be doing here by trying to replace all of my beliefs that I have now, whether true or false, with only beliefs that I am fully convinced of by the use of reason. Among the branches of philosophy, I had at an earlier period given some attention to logic, and among those of the mathematics to geometrical analysis and algebra. 3 arts or sciences which ought, as I conceived, to contribute something to my design. But on examination I found that, as for logic, its syllogisms and the majority of its precepts are of avail, rather in the communication of what we already know, or even, as the art of Lully, in speaking without judgment of things of which we are ignorant, than in the investigation of the unknown. So the idea there is, like, he wants to use logic and geometry and algebra and math to he wants those things to have a role in his system, because those things are super reliable and they're truth preserving, right? You have a couple basic premises and then you can derive a bunch of stuff from them that must follow necessarily, right? That necessarily must follow from a few true, simple premises, right? And his conclusion was that, well, that's nice, but what are the true premises, right? This isn't, that's the problem. Logic and math works great for stuff that we already know, but when we're trying to investigate stuff that we don't yet know, it doesn't really help us, right? We have nothing to fill in. We have nothing to plug in to the equations in certain situations. And those are the situations that he's most concerned about. And although this science contains indeed a number of correct and very excellent precepts, there are nevertheless so many others, and these either injurious or superfluous, mingled with the former, that it is almost quite as difficult to effect a severance of the true from the false as it is to extract a Diana or a Minerva from the rough block of marble. So, so even in these sciences that are very good, there's lots of nonsense, or there's lots of stuff that he's not convinced by, that's not very good. And so, like, trying to sort out, what bits of the science of logic or mathematics or geometry is good and what part is not good, that's a tricky issue in itself. Just like trying to, carve a Greek goddess into a statue of marble, into a block of marble. Then, as to the analysis of the ancients and the algebra of the moderns, besides that they embrace only matters highly abstract and to appearance of no use. The former is so exclusively restricted to the consideration of figures that it can exercise the understanding only on condition of greatly fatiguing the imagination. And in the latter there is so complete a subjection to certain rules and formulas that there results an art full of confusion and obscurity calculated to embarrass instead of a science fitted to cultivate the mind. Right, so he's saying, even though I love math and logic and geometry, it just doesn't seem like it's fitted to the, or it doesn't seem like it fits the goal that I'm trying to do here. Like, I want that level of certainty of, like, knowing that a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Like, I want that certainty, but I just can't apply those kind of principles to what I'm trying to do. Or at least directly, those principles don't really apply, right? We're not talking about figures here. We're talking about, all of our beliefs, knowledge itself, right? And by these considerations, I was induced to seek some other method which would comprise the advantages of the three and be exempt from their defects. And as a multitude of laws often hampers justice, so that the state is best governed when, with few laws, these are rigidly administered, in like manner, instead of the great number of precepts of which logic is composed, I believe that the four following would prove perfectly sufficient to me, provided I took the firm and unwavering resolution never in a single instance to fail in observing them. Okay, so now we're finally at, like, the upshot of his analogy from before of being, like, single-minded and focused and having a general design that has a few rules that you always follow. And he arrived at 4 rules that he thinks will serve as guiding principles in the use of reason. So this is, like, the method itself. So now we're at, like, finally the method of using reason correctly, according to Descartes. Right. So there it is. Cool. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. A few more pages, then we're on part 3. The first of the 4 precepts. Precepts or principles, right? The first was never to accept anything for true which I did not clearly know to be such. That is to say, carefully to avoid precipitancy. I don't know that word. That's a new one. Precipitancy and prejudice, and to comprise nothing more in my judgment than what was presented to my mind so clearly and distinctly as to exclude all ground of doubt. Right, so what's the idea here? Only believe what you are perfectly and clearly certain of, right? And never accept anything as true which I did not clearly know to be such, right? So only accept what is clearly true to you, and don't sort of use prejudice and precipitancy, whatever that means, to, like, make up additional judgment. Like, don't make additional inferences based on knowing one thing to be true, at least not without a rigorous application of the method later on, right? So you learn something new and just accept that and only that, so long as it is perfectly clear to you. Right? So don't, like, what am I trying to say here? Don't, like, add in extra things to a preposition. Like, don't derive Q from P just because you know that P is true, right? At least not yet. Not yet. So only accept things that you clearly know to be true. Okay. The second, to divide each of the difficulties under examination into as many parts as possible and as might be necessary for its adequate solution, right? So break things down into smaller parts. That's the other thing, right? So only accept things that are clearly and distinctly true, that you cannot doubt whatsoever, right? There's no possibility possibility of doubting it, and divide things into smaller bits. Right? Break things down into as many parts as possible and as is necessary to form a solution. So don't try and do too many things at once. Don't combine ideas, because when you combine ideas together, they get confused. So this is why very often one of the big ideas in Descartes that gets emphasized is the idea of clear and distinct ideas, right? He's big on having things be clear and distinct. Right? Divide the difficulties into as many parts as possible. That's number 2. The third, to conduct my thoughts in such order that by commencing with objects the simplest and easiest to know, I might ascend little by little, and as it were step by step, to the knowledge of the more complex, assigning in thought a certain order even to those objects which in their own nature do not stand in a relation of antecedence and sequence. Right? So break things down and move slowly. Right? Pursue a methodical order when you're dealing with complex thoughts. Right? Ascend, be satisfied with incremental progress, right? And gradually come to appreciate a more complex picture. It won't happen all at once, but just be satisfied with the idea that these things will come gradually, right? And pursue them methodically, right? Assigning them an order, even if there isn't a real sequence to them in nature, right? So even if it doesn't logically or naturally follow that you do this thing and then you should do that thing, just have a sequence in your head of how you're going to approach the problem, right? So only do things one at a time when they're perfectly clear and distinct. Divide all the problems into the smallest possible pieces and move sequentially through a problem, one piece at a time, even if the order isn't naturally justified. And the last, in every case, make enumerations so complete and reviews so general that I might be assured that nothing was omitted, right? So review your work. Review your work and right? Don't be afraid to go over your stuff multiple times and explore all the different possibilities and be totally certain that what you have is the truth, right? And this is his method. That's it, right? That's the method. The 4 things. Break things down. The 4 things. The first one. Focus only on the smallest units of information that can be known clearly and distinctly to you. And don't worry about the rest. One thing at a time. And then when you have something that's more complex, right, number 2, divide it into the smallest possible units that you can eventually come to know clearly and distinctly one at a time. Then proceed through the various different bits of the complex issue one at a time in a sort of sequence. And when you're done, review and go over and make sure that the whole picture fits together in the right sort of way, and look at everything all at once and completely so that you can be sure that you didn't miss anything, right? The long chains of simple and easy reasonings by means of which geometers are accustomed to reach their conclusions of their most difficult demonstrations had led me to imagine that all things, to the knowledge of which man is competent, are mutually connected in the same way, and that there is nothing so far removed from us as to be beyond our reach, or so hidden that we cannot discover it, provided only we abstain from accepting the false for the true, and always perceive in our thoughts the order necessary for the deduction of one truth from another. Okay, so again, he's trying to imitate the way that geometry works, where you have some very simple propositions and proofs that follow from them. Right, and this is going to lead to enlightenment, and right, there's nothing that can't be done, at least within the scope of knowledge, through this method, right? As long as we follow on the truth, right? This is just him expressing his faith in this method, right? This is always going to work. This is how you do it. This is it. And I had little difficulty in determining the objects with which it was necessary to commence, for I was already persuaded that it must be with the simplest and easiest to know. And considering that of all those who have hitherto sought truth in the sciences, the mathematicians alone have been able to find any demonstrations, that is, any certain and evident reasons. I did not doubt, but that such must have been the rule of their investigation. Right? So, again, he's looking at math and geometry and science and trying to imitate their methods because he wants that level of certainty. And he can't get that level of certainty directly because he's not talking about the same subject matter. But he wants the method to move from one proof, one line in the proof to the other. From 1 + 1 is 2, and 2 + 2 is 4, 4 + 4 is 8, right? Whatever. Like that certainty of moving from one line to the next, that is very common in mathematics. That's what we're after, right? And to do that, he sort of, this method, right, these four things, right, these four principles or precepts or whatever you want to call them, that's what he's claiming mathematicians do. Like, this is how math works, right? You only start with what's very simple and exact and precise, and you can know with absolute certainty. You break down bigger problems, larger equations into smaller little bits, each of which you can know with that absolute certainty. You follow an order, right? You proceed in order. You go from one thing to the next, right? Whatever the order might be. And then you go back and look at the big picture and you review and you make sure that you didn't miss anything. I resolved to commence, therefore, with the examination of the simplest objects, not anticipating, however, from this any other advantage than that to be found in accustoming my mind to the love and nourishment of truth, and to a distaste for all such reasonings as were unsound. But I had no intention on that account of attempting to master all the particular sciences commonly denominated mathematics. But observing that, however different their objects, they all agree in considering only the various relations or proportions subsisting among those objects, I thought it best for my purpose to consider these proportions in the most general form possible, without referring them to any objects in particular, except such as would most facilitate the knowledge of them, and without by any means restricting them to these, that afterwards I might thus be better able to apply them to every other class of objects to which they are legitimately applicable. Okay, so now there's a level of generality that many early modern philosophers speak with. That's sort of what makes philosophy very difficult and abstract, because he's talking about like objects, but he's not talking about like, everyday objects. He's talking about the objects of the objects of science, right? The topics of mathematics, right? Or any other science, right? Right? And the idea is to be as general as possible, again, because he wants to capture knowledge itself, right? He wants to capture, what is it that all of my true beliefs share, and how can I be sure that every single belief that I have ends up being true? And he's using, again, mathematics is the model, but not the topic. So he has to use what he thinks is mathematical methods, right? Namely the four things, right? The four precepts, with non-mathematical topics, right? And he's saying that even though the objects differ, right? Even though like he's talking about like beliefs and propositions about the world, and math is dealing with like numbers, right? It's a matter of understanding the relationships among these objects, right? And the proportions of these objects, right? Without referring to any objects in particular, right? So again, this is like, he's talking about logic here as well, right? Where it's, logic, when I say things like if A, then B, A, therefore B, right? It doesn't matter what you put in for A or B, right? It doesn't matter what fills in the variable there. The relations, the proportions between the statements is what matters for logic, right? The fact that, modus ponens and modus tollens work for anything that you plug in, right? For A or B in those proofs, right? And so he's trying to find like that, but at a different level of generality, right? He's not doing that just for like dealing with numbers or even just for dealing with propositions. He's talking about like the objects of knowledge itself, right? Ideas. But he's interested in the relations between these things, right? Perceiving further that in order to understand these relations, I should sometimes have to consider them one by one, and sometimes only to bear them in mind or embrace them in aggregate, I thought that in order to better consider them individually, I should view them as subsisting between straight lines, than which I could find no objects more simple or capable of being more distinctly represented to my imagination and senses. Again, like, I don't know exactly what's going on. Well, again, there's this analogy with geometry, right? Talking about straight lines and stuff, right? Where it's an analogy with, again, the certitude of mathematics and geometry applied to our knowledge in general. And on the other hand, that in order to retain them in memory or embrace an aggregate of many, I should express them by certain characters the briefest possible. In this way, I believed that I could borrow all that was the best in geometrical analysis and in algebra and correct all the defects of the one by the help of the other. So he's talking about how he managed to like combine his understanding of math, like algebra, and geometry together to form a more general method for approaching all knowledge overall, right? That's like the goal here, right? And in point of fact, the accurate observance of these few precepts gave me, I take the liberty of saying, such ease in unraveling all questions embraced in the two sciences, that in the 2 or 3 months I devoted to their examination, not only did I reach solutions of questions I had formerly deemed exceedingly difficult, but even as regards to questions of the solution of which I continued ignorant, I was enabled, as it appeared to me, to determine the means whereby and the extent to which a solution was possible, results attributable to the circumstance that I commenced with the simplest and most general truths, and that thus each truth discovered was a rule available in the discovery of subsequent ones. Nor in this perhaps shall I appear too vain, if it be considered that as the truth on any particular point is one, whoever apprehends the truth knows all that on that point can be known. Okay, so now he's saying he was so impressed with his method, and he used his method to study math and algebra, of only accepting what's absolutely true, work methodically, break things down, things like that, right? He used this method to actually do algebra and geometry, and he learned a bunch of new stuff, right? So he's like totally convinced that these precepts, these rules can lead to truth because he tested them, right? He tested them in doing math and geometry, right? And he says that, that it worked really well, right? Here's what I did, and it absolutely worked. And then I think, there's no period there, so I guess this is a new sentence because it's capital. Nor in this perhaps I shall appear too vain if it be considered that, as the truth on any particular point is one whomever apprehends the truth knows all that on that point can be known. Yeah, well, then he gives an example, so maybe this will be helpful. The child, for example, who has been instructed in the elements of arithmetic and has made a particular addition according to rule, may be assured that he has found, with respect to the sum of the numbers before him, and that in this instance is within the reach of human genius. Right. So again, like, I guess he's saying that his rules work because anyone can use them and arrive at the same conclusions, right? And that's why he believes that they're good, right? That they work. Now, in conclusion, the method which teaches adherence to the true order and an exact enumeration of all the conditions of the thing sought includes all that gives certitude to the rules of arithmetic. Yeah. Yeah. Again, he's saying, like, he's sort of trying to elaborate how his four principles follow from the way of properly doing arithmetic or math or geometry, how this stuff follows from them, and how they can be used to, how they can be applied to mathematical and geometrical problems in order to arrive at new things in a reliable way. But the chief ground of my satisfaction with this method was the assurance I had of thereby exercising my reason in all matters, if not with absolute perfection, at least with the greatest attainable by me. Besides, I was conscious that by its use my mind was becoming gradually habituated to clearer and more distinct conceptions of its object. Okay, so this is cool. Now he's saying that, like, another thing that he learned by applying this method was that he was, like, improving. Like, his brain was getting used to using this method, and that he was, like, by practicing it, he was getting better at it. He was getting better at looking only for the clear and distinct conceptions of whatever it was he was talking about or trying to learn. Right? So it's not just like you do it once and you follow this method and everything follows perfectly the first time. It takes practice. And he got better at it over time. And I hoped also, from not having restricted this method to any particular matter, to apply it to the difficulties of the other sciences with not less success than to those of algebra. Right? I should not, however, on this account have ventured at once on the examination of all the difficulties of the sciences which presented themselves to me, for this would have been contrary to the order prescribed in the method. But observing that the knowledge of such is dependent on principles borrowed from philosophy, in which I found nothing certain, I thought it necessary first of all to endeavor to establish its principles. So he's saying, well, now that I knew that this worked for geometry and math, I wanted to apply it everywhere. But I couldn't do that because that would be breaking one of my rules, because I have to do things sequentially. I need to make sure that I'm following an order, and not just going out and, looking for clear and distinct ideas wherever I might want to see them, right? Or whatever scientific area it may be. Instead, he had to start with philosophy, right? Because that's where these principles really came from. Specifically, the idea of clear and distinct ideas, and this idea of philosophy is like the most general subject. So he needed to start with philosophy. And because I observed, besides, that an inquiry of this kind was of all others of the greatest moment, and one in which precipitancy and anticipation in judgment were the most to be dreaded, I thought that I ought not approach it till I had reached a more mature age, being at that time but 23. Oh my God. And had first of all employed much of my time in preparation for the work, as well by eradicating from my mind all the erroneous opinions I had up to that moment accepted, as by amassing variety of experience to afford materials for my reasonings, and by continually exercising myself in my chosen method with a view to increased skill in its application. Okay. So now he's settled on his method. He's got the four bits, the four precepts, right? and he's ready to get to work and, solve all the problems and all the sciences. But he was only 23, and he thought to himself as a 23-year-old that I might be too young to, deal with all this stuff. So I need to do more practice. I need to go out into the world. I need to see more things. I need to learn more things. I need to exercise this method. I need to exercise my reasoning skill. And then I'll come back to this. Right. Yeah. Okay, so that was part 2. Yeah, lots of stuff going on there. Man, that's a doozy, right? So we've got this idea of a need to have a focused, grounded, unified approach to dealing with stuff, especially to arriving at the truth, and to improving our beliefs and getting as many true beliefs as we can and an understanding as much as we possibly can. That's going to take that's going to take a unified approach. And the unified approach comes based on looking at areas of science and knowledge that are most successful. And to Descartes, those are logic, mathematics, and geometry. Right? And in those, even though we can't apply those topics directly to the idea of only believing things that are true and of using reason to arrive at truth in the most effective way possible, we can derive principles and guidelines from mathematical and geometrical methods and approaches and apply those to other circumstances, namely towards making sure that we're using reason the right way. And these are the 4 principles, right? Once again, to only accept what we absolutely are certain of and what we can perceive clearly and distinctly, only clear and distinct ideas, right? Divide difficulties into as many parts possible, right? So break things down, go in order, and review so that nothing is omitted. Okay. And with that method in mind, we're going to be able to look at everything, look at all of our beliefs that we've accumulated over the years that aren't very trustworthy, right? Because they didn't come from trustworthy sources, and break it all down in one fell swoop, get rid of all the nonsense that we believe but shouldn't believe anymore, and rebuild our edifice of knowledge from scratch, from the bottom up. Okay, that was part 2. Now part 3. Okay, yeah, part 3. How long is this one? I mean, it does. Oh, this one's not too long. Okay, so we'll see. So this is like the ethics stuff. So we'll see. Okay, part 3. And finally, as it is not enough, before commencing to rebuild the house in which we live, that it be pulled down and the materials and the builders provided, or that we engage in the work ourselves according to a plan which we have beforehand carefully drawn out, but as it is likewise necessary that we be furnished with some other house in which we may live commodiously during the operations, so that I might not remain irresolute in my actions, while my reason compelled me to suspend my judgment, and that I might not be prevented from living thenceforward in the greatest possible felicity, I formed a provisionary code of morals, composed of 3 or 4 maxims, with which I am desirous to make you acquainted. Okay. Yeah, 1 sentence. God. Brutal. Yeah. So, right, so he's committed to getting rid of all of his beliefs and rebuilding all of them from scratch, right? Great thing, super cool, awesome. But in the meantime, you sort of need to live, and you need a way of living before you go and rebuild your edifice of knowledge that allows you to function in society, right? And this is it, right? This is his provisionary code of morals that sort of got him through this period of time before he was able to completely rebuild his life and live in accordance with reason perfectly, right? So here they are. Here are his morals that sort of follow from his method, but don't necessarily imply that he's already rebuilt the entire edifice of knowledge. The first was to obey the laws and customs of my country, adhering firmly to the faith in which, by the grace of God, I had been educated from my childhood, and regulating my conduct in every other matter according to the most moderate opinions and the farthest removed from extremes, which should happen to be adopted in practice with general consent of the most judicious of those among whom I might be living. So basically, I decided to follow all the laws and customs of wherever I was, right? Or at least of my country. And I'm assuming that I think he goes on to say that, wherever you live, follow those customs as well. And, focus on the most moderate opinions, ignore the extremes, or be farthest removed from the extremes. This goes back to a little bit of Aristotle, maybe, the doctrine of the mean, right? Finding virtue is in the middle of two extremes, right? So he's sort of agreeing with that, and follow the people who, generally consent, or follow the general consent of the most judicious of those among whom I might be living. So find some good role models of people who are successful and moderate and well respected, and just copy them. For as I had from that time begun to hold my own opinions for naught, because I wished to subject them all to examination, I was convinced that I could not do better than to follow in the meantime the opinions of the most judicious. Right? So while I wasn't fully, convinced of anything that I had accumulated myself in my own knowledge, because I haven't done the work to rebuild my entire belief system on my own, I decided to just follow the people who seemed to understand things the best. Just follow them. And although there are some perhaps among the Persians and the Chinese as judicious as among ourselves, expediency seemed to dictate that I should regulate my practice conformably to the opinions of those with whom I should have to live. Right? So even though there are probably really smart people in Persia and China, I'm going to just focus on following the people who seem to have it all figured out, or best figured out, that I'm closest to, right? That are here in the world that I live in, right? So so he's accepting a provisional commitment to the customs and the rules and whatever is most judicious in the place that he's living, rather than somewhere else. And it appeared to me that in order to ascertain the real opinions of such, namely of the people that he wants to imitate, I ought rather to take cognizance of what they practiced than of what they said. Not only because, in the corruption of our manners, there are few disposed to speak exactly as they believe, but also because very many are not aware of what it is they really believe. So then he's saying to imitate based on observation, right? So it's not about reading moral philosophy and people who have the best and most compelling moral arguments, but he's talking about following people who appear to be the best, or the most good and wise and trustworthy. For as the active mind by which a thing is believed is different from that by which we know that we believe it, the one act is often found without the other. Also, amid many opinions held in equal repute, I chose always the most moderate, as much for the reason that these are always the most convenient for practice, and probably the best, for all excess is generally vicious, as that in the event of my falling into error, I might be at less distance from the truth than if, having chosen one of the extremes, it should turn out to be the other which I ought to have adopted. Okay, so again, this is like doctrine of the mean stuff. He's basically leaning on Aristotle, right? All excess is generally considered vicious, right? And I guess, even Aristotle, it's just like common sense, right? How like a more moderate approach to things is usually, not always, but usually the most prudent and wise, right? And he's saying that, well, it's even better just as a matter of prudence to stick towards the middle, because if you're wrong, right, if one of the extremes is actually right, you're closer to the right answer than you would be if you picked the wrong extreme to stick to, right? Then you'd be like twice as far away from the truth. So stick to the middle until you have your mind completely made up and you have a clear and distinct notion of the truth being on one extreme or the other. That's pretty good. That's pretty wise. And I placed in this class of extremes especially all promises by which somewhat of our freedom is abridged. What does that mean? Hold on. And I placed in the class of extremes especially all promises by which somewhat of our freedom is abridged. All right, let's just keep going. Not that I disapproved of the laws which, to provide against the instability of men of feeble resolution, when it was sought to be accomplished, is some good, permits engagements by vows and contracts binding the parties to persevere in it, or even for the security of commerce, sanction similar engagements where the purpose sought to be realized is indifferent. I don't know what that means. Man, that's like a mouthful. That one's tricky. I guess let's keep going and maybe it'll make sense later. But because I did not find anything on earth which was wholly superior to change, and because, for myself in particular, I hoped gradually to perfect my judgments and not to suffer them to deteriorate, I would have deemed it a grave sin against good sense if, for the reason that I approved of something at a particular time, I therefore bound myself to hold it for good at a subsequent time, when perhaps it had ceased to be so, or I had ceased to esteem it as such. So I guess he's saying here that he didn't commit himself to many causes, right? He didn't want to be totally committed to laws or causes or promises that would limit his ability to change his mind later in life. Maybe that's what it is, right? Because he's in the process of trying to improve his judgments and improve himself. And if he, one day decided to I'm going to commit myself to this way of life, or I'm going to limit myself in this respect by being totally committed to this cause or that cause, then if it turns out that reason, when he has reconstructed his edifice of knowledge, says actually the most rational thing to do is this other thing, he would be stuck, right? He would be screwed. So that's what he means by not abridging his freedom, right? He doesn't want to commit himself to things that he might not be able to revise in accordance with reason by the time he reaches that level of enlightenment. So that's another argument for moderation, right? Moderation on the grounds that, I could change my mind about things. And in fact, I'm trying to change my mind about things. I'm trying to reform all of my beliefs therefore I should, leave myself in a flexible enough position such that when my beliefs are reformed, I'm able to react to them. Okay, my second maxim was to be as firm and resolute in my actions as I was able, and not to adhere less steadfastly to the most doubtful opinions, when once adopted, than if they had been highly certain. Okay, so this is interesting. The idea is um, when he's acting, right, when he's doing stuff, he has to act decisively. Right? So act decisively even in situations where you're not 100% certain. Right? Where you have room to doubt whether what you're doing is good or bad, right or wrong. Do it decisively, no matter what. Right? Don't adhere less steadfastly to the most doubtful opinion when once adopted than if they had been highly certain. Right? So even if I'm not sure, if I'm committed to something and I have to act in accordance with it, just do it as if you knew it was, as if you were absolutely certain of it. Right? So in our actions, don't waver, don't dally. Don't change your mind. Don't be be resolute in your actions. Right? Yeah, which is weird, and I mean it makes sense in the broader context because, like, the reason why he wants all the true beliefs is because he has to be resolute in his actions, right? Because that's the right thing to do. You should be resolute in all your actions, no matter how confident you are in them. So ideally, you would be in a situation where everything you do is based on the truth, right? That all your actions are informed by true beliefs. So you would be able to be 100% confident and resolute in anything that you do. Right? And Descartes is saying that, like, when you're not there yet, you still have to act as if you are. You still have to act as if you are fully certain of whatever it is that you're doing. Imitating in this the example of travelers who, when they have lost their way in a forest, ought not to wander from side to side, far less remain in one place, but proceed constantly the same side in a straight line and as straight a line as possible, without changing their direction for slight reasons, although perhaps it might come to be chance alone which at first determined the selection. So I guess, like, he's giving this analogy, and it's not really a great analogy, because it turns out that, like, most people, when they're stuck in the woods and they, like, walk in what they think is a straight direction, they're actually walking in circles, right? And lots of tragedy occurs as a result of this. People getting lost in the woods. They don't actually make any progress. They just walk in circles. So this isn't really a great analogy, but I get the idea is, like, just do something, go somewhere, proceed. Make sure you're moving forward no matter what you're doing, even if, like, you didn't have a really good reason to picking one direction or the other. Just pick something and stick with it. Right. For in this way, if they do not exactly reach the point they desire, they will come at least to the end, in the end, to some place that will probably be preferable to the middle of a forest. Right. So again, you can see the analogy, right? The idea is that just do something. Make some sort of progress. Don't just sit still, and don't wait to have the perfect plan. Just act decisively, even if you have limited information, because you just have to do something. In the same way, since in action it frequently happens that no delay is permissible, it is very certain that, when it is not in our power to determine what is true, we ought to act according to what is most probable. Okay, this is great, right? So again, this is nice. So there are moments, when we read Descartes, and he talks about clear and distinct ideas, and he talks about, like, you need absolute certainty before you can move on to the next thing, and the whole method that we talked about before of, like, to completely knock down all the things that we are not completely certain of and doubt absolutely everything, and if something can be doubted, then we should treat it as false, and blah blah blah, right? But he's a human being at the end of the day, right? And he says, look, a lot of times we have to make decisions and we have to do things based on imperfect information. And in those situations, we have to go with what's most probable, right? Make a decision tree and figure out, okay, what's most likely to happen if I do X, and act then, right? act in accordance with what is most probable, right? That's what we got to do. That's the next best thing we can do. And even although we should not remark a greater probability in one opinion than in the other, we ought notwithstanding to choose one or the other, and afterwards consider it, insofar as it relates to practice, as no longer dubious, but manifestly true and certain, since the reason by which our choice has been determined is itself possessed of these qualities. Okay, so here he's saying, like, look, and even in cases where it's like tough, where it's like a coin flip, where like we really don't know what's most likely to happen, like we have to pick something and then go with it as if it's the most reasonable and most likely to happen, because and we can't doubt that anymore, right? Because we have to act as if it's manifestly true and certain. We just have to. This principle was sufficient thenceforward to rid me of all the repentings and pangs of remorse that usually disturb the conscience of such feeble and uncertain minds as, destitute of any clear and determinate principle of choice, allow themselves one day to adopt a course of action as best, which they abandon next as the opposite. Right. So the idea is, don't change your mind all the time. Don't flip flop when you're acting. Right. You can, of course, revise your opinions in accordance with reason, right? You can learn new things and you can change your mind about stuff. But when it comes to action, right, pick a course and stick with it as if you had absolute certainty about it, right? That's the best way to be. Act decisively as if reason and absolute certainty was behind what you were doing. The best way to be. Don't be like people who, decide one thing and then the next day they change their mind and then the very next day they change your mind, right? You got to pick something, stick with it. That's what Descartes says. My third maxim was to endeavor always to conquer myself rather than fortune, and change my desires rather than the order of the world, and in general accustom myself to the persuasion that, except our own thoughts, there is nothing absolutely in our power. Okay, so this is just straight up Stoicism. This is just straight out of the handbook of Epictetus, which we did on this channel. This is exactly Stoicism, right? Focus on the self, your desires, your perception, and don't try and focus on controlling things that are outside of our control. Don't bother with that because it's not going to work, right? This is straight out of Stoicism. Right? So that when we have done our best in things external to us, all wherein we fail of success to be held, or all wherein we fail of success is to be held, as regards us, absolutely impossible. And this single principle seemed to me sufficient to prevent me from desiring for the future anything which I could not obtain, and thus render me contented. Right? So again, this is just straight Stoicism. Focus on what you can control, and one of the things you can control absolutely is your thoughts. Right? You can definitely control your thoughts, your psychological life, the way you perceive things, your understanding of the world, your actions, right? At least where they are conscious and volitional actions, right? Focus on that stuff. Don't focus on, trying to achieve outcomes that you really don't have any control over. For since our will naturally seeks those objects alone, which the understanding represents as in some way possible of attainment, it is plain that if we consider all external goods as equally beyond our power, we shall no more regret the absence of such goods as seem due to our birth, when deprived of them without any fault of ours, than our not possessing the kingdoms of China or Mexico, and thus making, so to speak, a virtue of necessity. We shall no more desire health and disease, or freedom and imprisonment, than we now do bodies incorruptible as diamonds, or the wings of birds to fly with. Right, so again, the idea is he's saying that, and when I do this, it works, because when I can sort of, for the same reason that I accept that, well, I'm not a king or an emperor or, a CEO, right? And I can, I don't feel sad that I don't have those crazy extravagant things. Also learn to accept along in that pile of things that are out of my control, anything else that might happen to me, right? When I'm sick and I wish I was healthy, think of that as being just as silly as, having a decent job and a normal life and wishing that you were a CEO, right? Like that's like that level of projection and envy is not really rational, right? There are cases where we are envious of things that are irrational for us to be envious of. And Descartes says, we'll take that attitude just for most things, right? And again, this is very much Stoic. Right? This is very Stoic. But I confess there is need of prolonged discipline and frequently repeated meditation to accustom the mind to view all objects in this light. And I believe that in this chiefly consisted the secret power of such philosophers as in former times were enabled to rise superior to the influence of fortune and, amid suffering and poverty, enjoy a happiness which their gods may have envied. So he's directly talking about the ancients, right? Including the Stoics, that this takes a lot of work. It's not easy to, look at the hand that you're dealt and saying, well, it is what it is. And I guess I'm going to lose this body part, or I guess I'm really sick right now. I guess I don't have much longer to live, or, I guess the government's going to repossess my whatever, or I guess I'm going to jail now, or whatever the tragedy might be, and sort of accept that with the indifference of a Stoic sage. That's, it's not easy. It's not easy, and it takes time and meditation and work, according to Descartes. 4. Occupied incessantly with the consideration of the limits prescribed to their power by nature, they become so entirely convinced that nothing was at their disposal except their own thoughts, that this conviction was of itself sufficient to prevent their entertaining any desire of other objects. That's the idea of, once you understand that the only thing that you can control is your own thoughts, you realize that desiring other objects is kind of silly because you can't control those. So why not direct your desire only towards that which you can control, so you can always have your desire satisfied, right? If you focus only on perceiving a situation so that you're satisfied with it, rather than on changing the situation itself, you're probably going to be more peaceful and happy and serene. And over their thoughts, they acquitted a sway so absolute that they had some grounds on this account for esteeming themselves more rich and more powerful, more free and more happy than other men who, whatever be the favors heaped on them by nature and fortune, if destitute of this philosophy, can never command the realization of all their desires. Right? So again, the philosopher who's very happy, understanding the truth and having full awareness and acceptance of their thoughts, and who, having full acceptance of the fact that most things in life they cannot control, they can end up happier than people who, are very wealthy or very prominent or very powerful, but are actually miserable. Right? So this is again the idea of philosophy as a guide, or philosophy as the doorway into freedom, into a rewarding and meaningful way of life that goes beyond mere material possession. In fine, to conclude this code of morals, I thought of reviewing the different occupations of men in this life with the view of making a choice of the best. And without wishing to offer any remarks on the employments of others, I may state that it was my conviction that I could do no better than continue that in which I was engaged, namely in devoting my whole life to the culture of my reason, and in making the greatest progress I was able in the knowledge of truth, on the principles of the method which I had prescribed to myself. Right. So again, he's saying, like, I reviewed all the different things that I could do, all the different ways I could live, all the different jobs I might have, and I decided that, well, the best thing to do is to, I guess, be a philosopher, right? To cultivate my reason in accordance with the method, right? The four things. This method, from the time I had begun to apply it, had been to me the source of satisfaction so intense as to lead me to believe that more perfect or innocent this has to be like an issue with the translation. This method, from the time I had begun to apply it, had been to me the source of satisfaction so intense as to lead me to believe that more perfect or more innocent could not be enjoyed in this life. Yeah, okay. So the method was very satisfying. Got it. And as by its means I daily discovered truths that appeared to me of some importance, and of which other men were generally ignorant, the gratification thence arising so occupied my mind that I was wholly indifferent to every other object. Besides, the three preceding maxims were founded singly on the design of continuing the work of self-instruction. For since God has endowed each of us with some light of reason by which to distinguish truth from error, I could not have believed that I ought for a single moment rest satisfied with the opinions of another, unless I had resolved to exercise my own judgment in examining these whenever I should be duly qualified for the task. All right, so again, so he's basically like promoting his method, and he's saying that it was so satisfying when I applied this method because I learned a bunch of stuff, all of it was good and true, and I realized once I knew it started working, and once I was really committed to it, and once it started yielding results, I realized that I should just do this for everything, right? I shouldn't believe anything that anybody says if it's possible for me to figure out the truth on my own, right? This is whenever I should be duly qualified for the task. So there might be some things that I have to take by trusting somebody else, or there might be some things that I have to just accept based on the authority of another. But in cases where I can figure out the truth of something and apply my method to increase my amount of true beliefs, I'm going to do that. Nor could I have proceeded on such opinions without scruple had I supposed that I should thereby forfeit any advantage for attaining still more accurate, should such exist. Opinions without scruple had I supposed that I could thereby forfeit any advantage for attaining still more accurate, such exist. Yeah, I think there's a word missing. Yeah. And, in fine, I could not have restrained my desires, nor remained satisfied, had I not followed a path in which I thought myself certain of attaining all the knowledge, the acquisition of which I was competent, as well as the largest amount of what is truly good, from what I could ever hope to secure. Again, right? The method was good. It seemed like it was working. It was leading me towards good things, and it's the three principles, not principles, but ethical rules that he just mentioned follow from them, right? Inasmuch as we neither seek nor shun any object except insofar as our understanding represents it as good or bad, all that is necessary to right action is right judgment, and to the best action the most correct judgment, that is, to the acquisition of all the virtues which all else that is truly valuable and within our reach, and the assurance of such an acquisition cannot fail to render us contented. Right? So again, he's just like sort of promoting the philosophical life, right? He's saying that on the way, this is the best sort of life we could live, basically. Right? We want, and that's super satisfying, right? It's really satisfying to live this life where you're acting in accordance with reason, doing things that are only reasonable and good and proper and sensible and justified by correct judgments. That's just the best way to live, right? And that's the goal. Having thus provided myself with these maxims, and having placed them in reserve along with the truths of faith, which have ever occupied the first place in my belief, I came to the conclusion that I might with freedom set about ridding myself of what remained of my opinions. Okay, so now he's he's discovered his maxims, right, his method, his ethical maxims, which, the things that were just mentioned. And now he's convinced that, okay, now I can get rid of what remains of my opinion. Now I can get rid of all the stuff that I've been trying to get rid of, all these beliefs that I really shouldn't have, that were just taught to me by custom when I never really subjected them to the scrutiny of reason. And inasmuch as I hope to be better able successfully to accomplish this work by holding intercourse with mankind than by remaining longer shut up in the retirement where these thoughts occurred to me, I betook me again to traveling before the winter was well ended. And during the 9 subsequent years, I did nothing but roam from one place to another, desirous of being a spectator rather than an actor in the plays exhibited on the theater of the world. And as I made it my business in each matter to reflect particularly upon what might fairly be doubted and prove a source of error, I gradually rooted out from my mind all the errors which had hitherto crept into it. Okay, so he says, I got my method, I got my maxims, I got my ethics, now I'm ready to go out and travel the world. And he did that for 9 years. He went out and he saw the world. Did a bunch of traveling, he went from place to place, so on and so forth. And now he started to get rid of all his beliefs that weren't reliable or weren't up to snuff, as it were. Not that in this I imitated the skeptics who doubt only that they may doubt. Oh, I know what he's saying here. Not that in this I imitated the skeptics who doubt only that they may doubt, right? Who doubt only for the sake of doubting, right? So he's talking about skeptics. Skepticism is the claim that we cannot know, really anything, right? Or there's no absolutely justifiable foundation for knowledge, right? And Descartes is saying that, it's not, he's looking down on that. He says, no, we clearly know some things, maybe even if, a lot of our beliefs aren't very reliable. So he's saying, those who doubt only for the sake of doubting and seek nothing beyond uncertainty itself, right? He's not doing that. He's not being like a skeptic. For on the contrary, my design was singly to find ground of assurance and cast aside the loosed earth and sand that I might reach the rock or the clay. In this, as appears to me, I was successful enough. For since I endeavored to discover the falsehood or incertitude of the propositions I examined, not by feeble conjectures, but by clear and certain reasoning, I met with nothing doubtful as not to yield some conclusion of adequate certainty, although this were merely the inference that the matter in question contained nothing certain. Right, so he's saying that he went, when he went around and studied the world and went from place A to B and so on and so forth, that he he wasn't doubting things just for the sake of it. He was doubting it so that he could build up his knowledge and certainty of the world in general, right? And along the way, he realized that there was really nothing that he couldn't doubt, right? Because especially traveling the world and seeing, as you mentioned before, seeing how differently people do things and just how diverse the various opinions of the world actually are, that there was no possible way that the great many of the things that he learned when he was younger could actually be true, right? Yeah, okay. And just as in pulling down an old house, we usually reserve the ruins to contribute towards the erection, so in destroying such of my opinions as I judged to be ill-founded, I made a variety of observations and acquired an amount of experience of which I availed myself in the establishment of more certain. So he's saying, even though I got rid of a bunch of beliefs in accordance with my method throughout my time, exploring the world and having all of my beliefs and opinions shaken, I didn't completely, it wasn't all for nothing. I learned a bunch of useful stuff along the way that sort of helped me rebuild as well, right? And further, I continued to exercise myself in the method I had prescribed, for besides taking care in general to conduct all of my thoughts in accordance to its rules, I reserved some hours from time to time which I expressly devoted to the employment of the method in the solution of mathematical difficulties, or even in solution likewise of some questions belonging to other sciences, but which, by my having detached them from such principles of these sciences as were of inadequate certainty, were rendered almost mathematical. The truth of this will be manifest from the numerous examples contained in this volume. Right? So he's saying, in addition to going around in the world and upsetting all his conventional and customary beliefs in all sorts of different topics, he also focused on, doing science, right, and doing math and doing geometry. And he's going to give some examples of that, right? Especially in, I think, part 5, where he talks about, or is it the next part, where he talks about circulation and medical sciences, medicine. So he used it and he applied it in many different areas, not just philosophy, not just science, not just mathematics, not just experience, but all that stuff put together. He used his method and his maxims of ethics and morality. And thus, without an appearance living otherwise than those who, with no other occupation than that of spending their lives agreeably and innocently, study to sever pleasure from vice, and who, that they may enjoy their leisure without ennui, have recourse to such pursuits as honorable, I was nevertheless prosecuting my design and making greater progress in the knowledge of truth than I might, perhaps, have made had I been engaged in the perusal of books merely, or in holding converse with men of letters, right? So again, he's saying that, even though, it seems like I just sort of traveled around and didn't do anything and was just bouncing around, kind of floating from one place to the next, as a wealthy European aristocrat, just going from one place to another willy-nilly, enjoying the countryside throughout my life with no fixed occupation, I guess. Even though it looked like I was just a bum, I was actually making great progress in the knowledge of truth. These 9 years passed away, however, before I had come to any determinate judgment respecting the difficulties which form matter of dispute among the learned, or had commenced to seek the principles of any philosophy more certain than the vulgar. So in his 9 years of traveling, he didn't actually, he didn't actually arrive at the absolute truth of the situation, right? He didn't actually reach his goal of perfect knowledge in those 9 years, right? Or solve all the problems in science. Big surprise. And the examples of many men of the highest genius who had in former times engaged in this inquiry, but, as appeared to me, without success, led me to imagine it to be a work of so much difficulty that I would not perhaps have ventured on it so soon had I not heard it currently rumored that I had already completed the inquiry. What? Okay, so he's saying that he was a bit discouraged that he hadn't figured everything out during his travels and his times and his writings about arithmetic and geometry or whatever. he was discouraged, except for the fact that people started saying that like he figured everything out. So it was like a rumor that like, oh yeah, no, Descartes, he figured it all out. Like, yep, you got it right. Yep, you've already completed. You've already figured out how to, how to get perfect knowledge. The perfect source of right, and I guess this is Cartesianism, right? He started getting followers. He had an ism named after him, right? And he was like, oh well, maybe I am onto something. Maybe I should write this down, and this is why he's writing the Discourse on Method. I know not what were the grounds of this opinion, and if my conversation contributed in any measure to its rise. This must have happened rather from my having confessed my ignorance with greater freedom than those are accustomed to do who have studied a little, and expounded perhaps the reason that led me to doubt of many things that by others are esteemed certain, than from having boasted of any system of philosophy. Okay, so right now he's comparing himself to Socrates. That's what he's doing, right? Very, very modest, right? He's confessing his ignorance with greater freedom than those are accustomed to do who have studied little, right? Which is Socrates, right? He doesn't claim to know anything. He just gets other people to, to reveal that they actually don't know anything. And that's the genius of Socrates and the Socratic method. Here Descartes like comparing himself to Socrates and saying, no, well, I just confessed my ignorance, right? I just confessed, I was just honest in claiming that I don't actually know anything, more so than people are used to, right? So there you go. It wasn't because he was like promoting a system. He was just like sort of doing his thing, and people, decided that, oh yeah, this guy really does have a reliable method. But as I am of a disposition that makes me unwilling to be esteemed different from what I really am, I thought it necessary to endeavor by all means to render myself worthy of the reputation accorded to me. And it is now exactly 8 years since this desire constrained me to remove from all those places where interruption from any of my acquaintances was possible, and betake myself to this country, in which the long duration of war has led to the establishment of such discipline that the armies maintained seem to be of use only in enabling the inhabitants to enjoy more securely the blessings of peace, and where, in the midst of a great crowd actively engaged in business and more careful of their own affairs than curious about those of others, I have been able to live without being deprived of any of the conveniences to be had in the most populous cities, and yet as solitary and as retired as in the midst of the most remote deserts. Okay, so he's saying that, after his journey around the world in the past 8 years, he's been able to like work in peace without anyone bothering him. He was definitely like a hermit kind of person after his traveling, at least, right? And he just wanted to work and not be bothered. And I don't know which country he's in, actually. Maybe Amsterdam? Or maybe, Amsterdam's not a country, but I think that's where he is. But I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, so nevertheless, right now he's like, after he's been convinced that his method is good and reliable, and it has yielded fruits, and it has impressed other people, and it has led to important discoveries, right? So he's convinced of its utility, and for the past couple of years, he's just been trying his best to not only apply it, but now finally to just come out and expound it in a sort of autobiographical way, where he's like sort of showing how he came around to accepting and adopting and utilizing this method. Okay, that's part 3. And I think I'm going to call it. Yeah, we're just at 3 hours. I think that's enough. Part 4, 5, and 6 will have to be another video. I guess it'll be long too, because 4, 5, and 6 are, I think, longer than the previous ones. So even though we're halfway to part 6, we are less than halfway through the work. Actually, you know what? Let's just do part 4. Let's just do it. Part 5 is on page 23. So part 5 is actually like the proper halfway point, at least in terms of text. So we'll just go through part 4. Let's just keep going. Okay. Part 4. I am in doubt as to the propriety of making my first meditations in the place above mentioned matter of discourse. Yeah, there's a word missing. Like, there are words missing in this translation. For these are so metaphysical and so uncommon as not perhaps to be acceptable to everyone, right? So here he is, like, sort of talking about how philosophy is too abstract for anyone to really care about it. And he's admitting that, like, I'm sorry, like, my meditations is... Oh, wait, no, I think I know what he's doing here. Wait a minute. I see. Okay. So now he's gonna start doing his meditation. I think that's what's going on here. Well, let's just keep reading. Again, we're in the place above mentioned matter of discourse, right? Like, above mentioned matter of discourse, or is it in place of the above mentioned matter of discourse, right? So is he saying that like he doesn't want to put his meditations first because then it would be too abstract? At least, okay, that's how I'm reading it. And yet, that it may be determined whether the foundations that I have laid are sufficiently secure, I find myself in a measure constrained to avert them. I had long before remarked that in relation to practice, it is sometimes necessary to adopt, as if above doubt, opinions which we discern to be highly uncertain, as has been already said. But as I then desired to give my attention solely to the search after truth, I thought that a procedure exactly the opposite was called for, and that I ought to reject as absolutely false all opinions in regard to which I could suppose the least ground for doubt, in order to ascertain whether after that there remained aught in my belief that was wholly indubitable. Okay, so now he's introducing the method of doubt, where he's saying that, like, I know I said all that stuff, at least when we're dealing with, like, practical issues and we're trying to get along in the world and we have to make decisions and we have to deal with the fact that we have imperfect knowledge and all that, yada yada, right? In those situations, yes, we have to like, be decisive and accept the uncertainty and deal with the situation. But at a certain point, when we're really serious about just getting after the truth, what we have to do is reject as absolutely false anything that could be doubted. And this is the method of doubt, right? If we want to get at what's absolutely true, we have to remove everything that can possibly be doubted, right? And this is the point that he eventually came to, right? He eventually came to this conclusion. Accordingly, seeing that our senses sometimes deceived us, I was willing to suppose that there existed nothing really such as they presented to us, and because some men err in reasoning and fall into paralogisms, even on the simplest matters of geometry, I, convinced that I was open to error as any other, rejected as false all the reasonings I had hitherto taken for demonstrations. And finally, when I considered that the very same thoughts, or presentations of the thoughts, which we experience when awake may also be experienced when we are asleep, while there is at that time not one of them true, I suppose that all the objects, presentations of them, that had ever entered into my mind when awake, had in them no more truth than the illusions of my dreams. But immediately upon this I observed that whilst I thus wished to think that all was false, it was absolutely necessary that I, who thus thought, should be somewhat. And as I observed that this truth, I think, therefore I am, that's cogito ergo sum, was so certain and of such evidence that no grounds of doubt, however extravagant, could be alleged by the skeptics capable of shaking it, I concluded that I might without scruple accept it as the first principle of philosophy which I was in search. Okay, so this right here, basically a summary of the meditations. Right, this is Descartes' meditations. This is it. Okay. First, he's going to introduce the method of doubt. Right, everything needs to be doubted. Right, if anything can be doubted, then I should treat it as false, and then whatever is left is going to be absolutely true. That's the idea. And first, he says the sensory knowledge, right? Like our senses deceive us. So, I could be seeing, a screen in front of me right now, but I could be being deceived. So I can't trust that, right? Or even geometry. I could doubt that because maybe the people who do geometry are mistaken, right? And maybe I'm mistaken about the rules of geometry. I could be wrong, right? But that I could be wrong. So he gets rid of everything where he could possibly be wrong, including things, even with mathematics and geometry, which he loves, typically, right? And he said that even that stuff can't be fully certain of it. Can't be completely certain of it. And here's the dream example, right? And of course, everything that I'm thinking and seeing right now, it could just be a dream. It could be a dream. Could be a dream. And because everything, basically all the thoughts I have right now could be a dream, they're all subject to doubt, and I have to get rid of them all. Right? But once I did that, what was left? Well, what was left was the truth that I exist. Namely, that I think and I exist. Right? Even though I might be being deceived, even though I am being deceived, I am still thinking. And I cannot be deceived about my thinking, because if I was not thinking, then I would cease to be. That's what this means. Think, therefore I am. Cogito ergo sum. Okay? And there's no grounds for doubting that. Right? No matter what sort of weird thought experiment or evil demon or whatever you might think of, there's no way to doubt, I think, therefore I am. In the next place, I attentively examined what I was, and as I observed that I could suppose that I had no body, and that there was no world nor any place in which I might be, but that I could not therefore suppose that I was not, namely that I didn't exist, and that, on the contrary, from the very circumstance that I thought the doubt of the truth of other things, it most clearly and certainly followed that I was, that I existed, right? So again, he's just repeating that, like, no matter how hard I doubt, I still exist. While, on the other hand, if I had only ceased to think, although all the other objects which I had ever imagined had been in reality existent, I would have had no reason to believe that I existed. I thence concluded that I was a substance whose whole essence or nature consists only in thinking, and which, that it may exist, has need of no place nor is dependent on any material thing. Okay, so this is an argument for the existence of the soul. That's what this is, right? So we get I think therefore I am, right? Cogito ergo sum. And then we get, well, if I exist on the grounds of my thinking, and I am a thinking thing, then I am not a physical thing, because I can doubt the existence of all the physical stuff in the world, but I can't doubt the existence of the thinking stuff in the world, namely my thinking. And the part of me that thinks is the soul, right? So that I, that is to say, the mind by which I am what I am, is wholly distinct from the body, and is even more easily known than the latter, than the body, and is such that although the latter were not, it would still continue to be all that it is. Right? So he's saying that even if I had no body, right, because I can imagine myself without a body, I would still be a thinking thing. And if I'm a thinking thing, then I am not a physical thing. And the thinking but not physical part of me, the mind, that's the soul. That's the soul. Okay, hold on one sec here. Sorry. Okay, yeah. Had to check something. Okay, we're good. After this, I inquired in general into what is essential to the truth and certainty of a proposition. For since I had discovered one which I knew to be true, I thought that I must likewise be able to discover the ground of this certitude. So, right. So this is cool, right? So he's gotten rid of everything that can be doubted. He found the one statement that is absolutely true, namely that he's a thinking thing, right? And now he wants to figure out, well, what are the qualities of that one truth that maybe I can use to identify other truths, right? So now he wants to analyze this proposition that he cannot possibly doubt and figure out what else he can learn from it, right? And as I observed that in the words "I think, therefore I am," there is nothing at all which gives me assurance of their truth beyond this, I see very clearly that in order to think, it is necessary to exist. I concluded that I might take as a general rule the principle that all the things which were very clearly and distinctly all the things which we very clearly and distinctly conceive are true, only observing that there is some difficulty in rightly determining the objects which we distinctly conceive. Right? So he goes from "I think, therefore I am" to the criteria of absolute, undoubtable truths being clear and distinct. Right? The idea needs to be clear and distinct. Right? That's the standard for true, indubitable, undeniable, absolute propositions. In the next place, from reflecting on the circumstance that I doubted, and that consequently my being was not wholly perfect, for I clearly saw it was a greater perfection to know than to doubt, I was led to inquire whence I had learned to think of something more perfect than myself. And I clearly recognized that I must hold this notion for some nature which in reality was more perfect. Okay, so now he's going through the argument for the existence of God, right, which is more perfect than him, right? So he covers like a lot of ground. Like this is in the meditations, right? Descartes' meditations. This is like more, spread out. This is there's more time to let these ideas breathe. But here he sort of just like rapid fire goes through the main arguments of the meditation. So it's kind of like the Cliff Notes version, I guess. Even though I'm pretty sure this was published first in 1637. But the meditations wasn't published until 1641. Yeah. Okay. Oh, where did I go? Reflecting a certain Oh, okay. Right. Perfection, right? So now he realizes that, okay, I have clear and distinct ideas. I'm a thinking thing. And now I've also noticed that I'm not perfect. Right? But I'm moved a little closer to perfection. But that's weird, because if I'm not perfect, how can the idea of perfection be clear and distinct to me? Right? How can I know what perfection is without clearly and distinctly perceiving it? Because I know that I'm not perfect. Right? So I clearly recognize that I must hold this notion from some nature which in reality was more perfect. As for the thoughts of many other objects external to me, as the sky, the earth, light, heat, and 1,000 more, I was less at a loss to know whence these came. For since I remarked in them nothing which seemed to render them superior to myself, I could believe that, if these were true, there were dependencies on my own nature, insofar as it possessed a certain perfection, and if they were false, that I held them from nothing, that is to say, that they were in me because of a certain imperfection of my nature. Again, he's sort of saying that, like, reason itself is able to, if these things were, let's just read it again. And I clearly recognize I must hold this notion from something. Okay, so something else is more perfect than me. As for the thoughts of many other objects external to me, right? So things in the world, the sky, light, the earth, heat, 1,000 more. These weren't mysterious for me. Right? Oh, because if these were true, they were dependencies in my own nature, insofar as it possessed a certain perfection. If they were false, that I held them from nothing. That is to say, that they were in me because of a certain imperfection in my nature. Okay, so I don't actually really get this line of reasoning. Maybe I'm just not smart enough, but something. Okay, we have the idea of perfection somehow, right? When looking at other things, whether they're true or false, there's some relationship to perfection that we can, suss out here. Okay, cool. But this could not be the case with the idea of a nature more perfect than myself. Right, so there's some stuff that isn't very mysterious when we relate it to perfection, but the idea of something more perfect than myself, that's mysterious because I only arrive at a certain level of perfection, right? And again, it's weird because nowadays, people don't, perfection doesn't come in degrees, really. You either are perfect or you're not, right? It's kind of like being pregnant, right? You're either pregnant or you're not. It's binary. It's one or the other, right? You're either perfect or you're imperfect, right? But he's talking about levels of perfection, and he's saying that, okay, I guess the more truth that I have, oh, right, okay, so that's what he's saying here, right? If it were true, if my views about the sky and the earth and all the things in the physical world, if those were true, then they would contribute to my own perfection because I would be accurately representing the world as including them. Right? Whereas, if I believe false things, that would contribute to my imperfection. Right? So I'm more perfect insofar as I believe more true and accurate things, and I'm less perfect insofar as I believe more false things. So I'm always at a level of perfection based on the mixture of true things and false things that I believe. We want to maximize the true ones and minimize the false ones so I can increase in my perfection. But nevertheless, there is an idea of a perfection that's higher than where I am now, right? And the question Descartes asks is, where does that come from? Where does that idea of something more perfect than me come from? Because I'm always stuck at one level of perfection, and I can only comprehend where I am right now. I can't really comprehend the idea of something being more perfect because I'm not there. So where does this idea come from? I'm pretty sure that's the reasoning. Right? For to receive it, namely the idea of a being more perfect than myself, to receive it from nothing was a thing manifestly impossible. And because it is not less repugnant that the more perfect should be an effort of and dependence on the less perfect, and that something should proceed from nothing, it was equally impossible that I could hold it from myself accordingly. It but remained that it had been placed in me by a nature which was in reality more perfect than mine, and which even possessed within itself all the perfections of which I could form any idea. That is to say, in a single word, which was God. Right? So he's saying that This is argument for the existence of God, right? The fact that I have an idea of a being more perfect than me comes from the fact that God put that idea in me, right? That idea doesn't come from me because I'm only ever stuck at a certain level of perfection. The idea of something more perfect comes from elsewhere. It comes from God. And to this I added that, since I knew some perfections which I did not possess, I was not the only being in existence. I will here, with your permission, freely use the terms of the schools. I think that means like now he's going to start using like medieval scholastic philosophical jargon, which he wasn't like a big fan of, even though he knew it really well. Right? That was his, how he grew up. That was his bread and butter. Right, so once he figures out that God exists because the idea of perfection exists in him and that idea can only come from God, then he figures out that, there must be more than one being, right? Because it's not just Descartes, it's Descartes and God. So this is how he gets out of solipsism, which is the view that only I exist, right? I only have evidence that I exist. I don't have evidence that anyone else exists. But Descartes' proof for the existence of God here proves that at least God exists. So there's at least two. But on the contrary, that there was of necessity some other more perfect being upon whom I was dependent, and from whom I had received all that I possessed. Right? So there's at least another being. It's God, right? So there's more than one. For if I had existed alone and independently of every other being, so as to have had from myself all the perfection, however little, which I actually possessed, I should have been able, for the same reason, to have had from myself the whole remainder of perfection, the want of which I was conscious, and thus could of myself have become infinite, eternal, immutable, omniscient, all-powerful, and, in fine, have possessed all the perfections which I could recognize in God. Right? So, if it was the case that the ideas of perfection came from me and not from God, then I could just will myself to be perfect in all these different respects, right? Eternal, timeless, knowing everything, all-powerful, and all that, right? So that stuff must have come from God. For in order to know the nature of God, whose existence has been established by the preceding reasonings, as far as my own nature permitted, I had only to consider in reference to all the properties of which I found in my mind some idea, whether their possession was a mark of perfection. Right? So all these different ideas that I had in my mind must have come from God. And I was assured that no one which indicated any perfection was in him, and that none of the rest was a wanting. Right? So the idea of God came from God, was put into me, and that's why I have these ideas of God, right? The idea of God, of a fully perfect being that possesses all the different perfections, did not come from me alone. If it came from me alone, then I would be able to become perfect myself, but I'm not. So those ideas must have come from God. Thus I perceived that doubt, inconstancy, sadness, and such like could not be found in God, since I myself would have been happy to be free from them. Besides, I had ideas of many sensible and corporeal things. For although I might suppose that I was dreaming, and that all which I saw or imagined was false, I could not, nevertheless, deny that the ideas were in reality in my thoughts. Okay, so again, this is more like there's some things I can doubt, there's some things I can't. The ideas that I have, they must have come from God. There's ideas that I have that, this is for the perfection of God, right? But because I had already very clearly recognized in myself that the intelligent nature is distinct from the corporeal, and as I observed that all composition is an evidence of dependency, and that a state of dependency is manifestly a state of imperfection, I therefore determined that it could not be a perfection in God to be compounded of these two natures, and that consequently he was not so compounded. Right? Composition is evidence of dependency. Dependency, state of imperfection, and therefore God is not compounded. Right? So God is perfect. That's basically what he's arguing. Right? And he needs to say this because he's going to get himself in trouble with the church, and a lot of his followers will get himself in trouble with the church for suggesting that like God is not perfect. Something. Right? He's gonna get himself in some trouble. So he's got to like make all these very careful arguments about God, so he's not like committing blasphemy. But that if there were any bodies in the world, or even any intelligences or other natures that were not wholly perfect, their existence depended on his power in such a way that they could not subsist without him for a single moment. I was disposed straight away to search for other truths, and when I had represented to myself the object of the geometers, which I conceived to be a continuous body or a space indefinitely extended in length, breadth, and height or depth, divisible into diverse parts which admit of different figures and sizes, and of being moved or transposed in all manner of ways, for all this the geometers suppose to be in the objects they contemplate, I went over some of their simplest demonstrations. Right, so now, like, with this confidence in, he's an existing, thinking thing, or he exists, he is thinking, he's a soul that's immortal, God exists, and God is perfect, God is responsible for certain ideas in him. Now he can move on to search for other truths that he can be absolutely certain of. And the first place he's going to go to is geometry, because he really wants to make sure that that is as true as it seems. Right? And in the first place, I observed that the great certitude by which common consent is accorded to these demonstrations is founded solely upon this, that they are clearly conceived in accordance with the rules I have already laid down. Right? So geometry is good. So now he feels confident going to geometry and saying, well, does geometry accord with the method and the clear and distinct ideas, and it's not doubtable and there's absolute certainty? Yes it does. In the next place, I perceived that there was nothing at all in these demonstrations which could assure me of the existence of their object. Thus, for example, supposing a triangle to be given, I distinctly perceived that its 3 angles were necessarily equal to 2 right angles. But I did not on that account perceive anything which could assure me that any triangle existed. While, on the contrary, recurring to the examination of the idea of a perfect being, I found that the existence of the being was comprised in the idea in the same way that the equality of its 3 angles to 2 right angles is comprised in the idea of a triangle, or as in the idea of a sphere, the equidistance of all points on the surface from its center, or even still more clearly. And that consequently, it is at least as certain that God, who is this perfect being, is or exists as any demonstration of geometry can be. Okay, so this is like a further proof for the argument, or a further argument for the existence of God is the idea that God necessarily exists because of its properties, or his properties, I guess, right? Where God's perfection implies existence, right? So this is like a separate argument. So the previous argument was that I need the idea of God to have the idea of perfection, right? And now the idea is that because God is perfection, he must exist. And I know this through geometric reasoning, which I know in turn to be true, because it cannot be doubted, and it follows all the right rules, and it's totally kosher. Okay. But the reason which leads many to persuade themselves that there is difficulty in knowing this truth, right? Knowing that God exists, and even also in knowing what their mind really is, namely a thinking thing, is that they never raise their thoughts above sensible objects, and are so accustomed to consider nothing except by way of imagination, which is a mode of thinking limited to material objects, that all that is not imaginable seems to them not intelligible. The truth of this is sufficiently manifest from the single circumstance that the philosophers of the schools accept as a maxim that there is nothing in the understanding which was not previously in the senses, in which, however, it is certain that the ideas of God and of the soul have never been. I think he's arguing against empiricism or certain kinds of empiricism, right? The truth that the maxim, there's nothing in the understanding which was not previously in the senses, right? So basically he's arguing in favor of innate ideas, right? That there are some ideas that we are born with. And this is one of the key tenets of rationalism, right? That we are born with certain ideas that don't come from the senses, right? And the idea that everything we know comes first from the senses is empiricism, right? The idea that we are a blank slate, tabula rasa, right? Which is most famously, eventually expressed in the empiricism, most famously the British empiricists like Locke and Hume. But here Descartes arguing against that as the sort of quintessential rationalist Cartesian, of course, Descartes, right? That, the idea of God has never been present to the senses, right? We don't ever perceive God, right? At least through our physical, our senses. And yet we are certain that God exists because of the proof that Descartes just gave. And it appears to me that they who make use of their imagination to comprehend these ideas do exactly the same thing as if, in order to hear sounds or smell odors, they strove to avail themselves of their eyes. Right, so basically people are just in denial that they have the idea of God, or they're in denial that the idea or the concept of God doesn't come from the senses, right? So they try to, it's just like trying to see a sound, right? Or see a smell. Unless indeed that there is this difference, that the sense of sight does not afford us an inferior assurance to those of smell or hearing. Right, but it does, right? It does. We can't see smells. In place of which neither our imagination nor our senses can give us assurance of anything unless our understanding. Again, so now he's talking about how the senses are deceiving. They deceive us all the time, and they only do one thing at a time. But meanwhile, our understanding, our reason, can perceive that God must necessarily exist all by itself. Finally, if there still be persons who are not sufficiently persuaded of the existence of God and of the soul by the reasons I have adduced, I am desirous that they should know that all the other propositions, of the truth of which they deem themselves perhaps more assured, as that we have a body, and that there exist stars and an earth, and such like, are less certain. For although we have moral assurance of these things, which is so strong that there is an appearance of extravagance in doubting of their existence, yet at the same time no one, unless his intellect is impaired, can deny, when the question relates to a metaphysical certitude, that there is sufficient reason to exclude entire assurance in the observation that when asleep we can in the same way imagine ourselves possessed of another body, and that we see other stars and another earth, when there is nothing of the kind. Right, so again, he's saying, if you still doubt, right, he's sort of restating the argument here. Like, if you still doubt the existence of God and the soul, and think that, actually we can only be certain of the things that we can perceive, like the stars and the earth itself and the things around us, he reinforces the idea that, well, we could be dreaming all of those things. So actually we can doubt those things. The only things we can't doubt is the stuff I just mentioned, right? That I'm a thinking thing, that I'm a thinking thing that exists, that I am identical to my mind, which is identical to my soul, that God exists, God gave me the idea of perfection, therefore God must exist, and that when I deduce based on God's properties a proof and an analysis of God's other properties, then one of those properties must be that he exists. Right? These things we can know with much more certainty than the fact that the world exists. Or how do we know that the thoughts which occur in dreaming are false, rather than those other which we experience when awake? Since the former are often not less vivid and distinct than the latter, right? So dreams are really a source of anxiety for Descartes. He really thinks that dreaming, the possibility that everything is a dream is really concerning for the possibility of knowledge. And though men of the highest genius study this question as long as they please, I do not believe that they will be able to give any reason which can be sufficient to remove this doubt, unless they presuppose the existence of God. So the only way we can get rid of doubt of the external world is if we assume that there is a God. And luckily for us, we have a proof from Descartes, an absolute certainty that God exists. Good for us. For, in the first place, even the principle which I have already taken as a rule, namely that all the things which we clearly and distinctly conceive are true, is certain only because God is or exists, and because he is a perfect being, and because all that we possess is derived from him. Whence it follows that our ideas or notions, which to the extent of their clearness and distinctness are real and proceed from God, must to that extent be true. Okay. Right, so now he's saying that the principles that he's been following actually owe their utility and reliability to the fact that God exists. Right. Accordingly, whereas we not infrequently have ideas or notions in which some falsity is constrained, this can only be the case with such as are to some extent confused and obscure, and in this proceed from nothing, state of negation. That is, exist in us, thus confused because we are not wholly perfect. Right? Again, it's talking about the different degrees of perfection. Where, when we are wrong, it's because things are imperfect in us. And it is evident that it is not less repugnant that falsity or imperfection, insofar as it is imperfection, should proceed from God, than that truth or perfection should proceed from nothing. So he's saying wherever there is God, right? Because God is perfect. Whenever we approach godliness, the more perfection we have. Our perfection comes from God. Our imperfection does not. But if we did not know that all which we possess of real and true proceeds from a perfect and infinite being, however clear and distinct our ideas might be, we should have no ground on that account for the assurance that they possessed the perfection of being true. Okay, so, this is getting a little less persuasive, but the idea is that all the stuff we know to be true actually comes from God, and now we know that God exists because we've derived the proofs, but actually the proofs themselves rely on the existence of God to be true. That kind of sounds circular, the way I just put it. So either it is circular, which people have definitely accused arguments for the existence of God of being circular, or I'm misunderstanding, which is also possible. But after the knowledge of God and of the soul has rendered us certain of this rule, we can easily understand that the truth of the thoughts we experience when awake ought not in the slightest degree be called in question on account of the illusions of our dream. Right, so nevertheless, we can have certainty as we go through life and not worry that everything could be a dream because of God. God sort of guarantees that, no, actually we're not all crazily deluded. This is the real world. We are really doing stuff. Life is really happening. It's not all a dream, and move on from there. For if it had happened that an individual, even when asleep, had some very distinct idea, as, for example, if a geometer should discover some new demonstration, the circumstances of his being asleep would not mitigate against its truth. This is like this possibility comes in earlier in the meditations, but he, I guess it's like, it just comes in later here. The idea is that, like, even if you dream, like, some things, sort of, there's some continuity in dreams, namely, like 1 + 1 is still 2 in dreams. I think, arguably, that's the claim anyway. Right? And as for the most ordinary error of our dreams, which consists in their representing to us various objects in the same way as our external senses, this is not prejudicial, since it leads us very properly to suspect the truth of the ideas of sense. Right, so dreams only deceive us because we take them to be true, because in dreams we see things, right, with our senses, and we feel things with our senses. And even though those are incorrect when we wake up, the mechanism by which we receive that information, quote unquote, is through the senses, and we believe it because the senses tend to be reliable. We are not infrequently deceived in the same manner when awake, right? Because this happens all the time. Our senses deceive us. As when a person in the jaundice sees all objects yellow, or when the stars or bodies at a great distance appear to us much smaller than they are. For, in fine, whether awake or asleep, we ought never allow ourselves to be persuaded of the truth of anything unless on the evidence of our reason. So again, he's saying that, like, the only reason that we are correct about anything is because we use our faculty of reason to adjudicate the information we get from our senses, right? And the reason we can do that is because of God and God's perfection given to us, and the faculty of reason as well, which in turn gives us these innate ideas, namely of God, of perfection, of I think therefore I am, of I am a thinking thing, and the immortal soul, and all that. And it must be noted that I say of our reason, and not of our imagination or our senses. Thus, for example, and it must be noted that I say of our reason, and not of our imagination or our senses, right? So imagination is when you, like, manipulate ideas in the mind, right? And that's like, this is a very technical, scholastic use of imagination and the senses, right? So the imagination and the senses are the other, like, sources of knowledge that people were arguing about back in the day. And he's saying, no, it's reason that is the source of knowledge, and reason itself is responsible for some ideas. Reason along with God, right? Deduction can get us at innate ideas that don't have any source in the senses. That's like one of the main theses of Cartesianism, right? The idea of innate ideas. And reason is the only source of truth or true belief. Thus, for example, although we very clearly see the sun, we ought not therefore to determine that it is only of the size which our sense of sight presents, right? So we look at the sun and it looks like this big, right? Pretty small, not that big. But actually it's massive, it's just very far away. That's why it looks small to us, right? Although we very clearly see the sun, we ought not therefore to determine that it is only of the size which our sense of sight presents. And we may very distinctly imagine the head of a lion joined to the body of a goat, without being therefore shut up to the conclusion that chimeras exist. For it is not a dictate of reason that what we thus see or imagine is really existent, but it plainly tells us that all our ideas or notion contain in them some truth. For otherwise it could not be that God, who is wholly perfect and veracious, should have placed them in us. So the idea is that all of our ideas or notions have some degree of truth. And that degree of truth, right, that degree of truth exists within us as perfection, and all perfection comes from God. Okay. So that's why we cannot be completely deceived, because there is a foundation for absolute knowledge. It's in the stuff at the beginning of part 4. And because our reasonings are never so clear or so complete during sleep as when we are awake, although sometimes the acts of our imagination are then as lively and distinct, if not more so, than in our waking moments, reason further dictates that since all our thoughts cannot be true because of our partial imperfection, those possessing truth must infallibly be found in the experience of our waking moments rather than in that of our dreams. Right? So, so basically, like, this is ruling out the possibility that we can be deceived by dreams at this point, right? So earlier on, because dreams could be doubted, they cannot be anything that happens in them or anything that appears to come from a source that also appears in a dream, namely our senses. We have to doubt all of those sources of knowledge as well. But at this point now, Descartes seems confident that actually we can not worry about dreams, right? We don't have to worry about dreams anymore. Not to say that we should trust the dreams, of course, but the idea is that our reasoning just works better when we're awake. Therefore, we should trust what happens when we're awake more than we should trust what happens in our dreams. And we can usually tell the difference. Right? Yeah, that's interesting. So imagination is more active when we are asleep, but reason is more active when we are awake. Therefore, we should trust our waking moments more than our dreaming. So there you go. Okay. So there we go. That's the Discourse on Methods 1 to 4. There you go. That's it. What was that? 23 pages almost. Oof. Well, I guess with the first page was cut off a bit, so 22 pages. That was a lot. What time we at here? 3:47. Almost 4 hours. Wow, almost 4 hours of straight philosophy. Okay, well, yeah, that's the Discourse on Method. We just read through it, and I gave you my take. Like I said, it's a big work. It's an important work. Part 4 is really, I think part 4 is really fascinating, especially if you're familiar with the meditations, because you can see, it's really a condensed version of the main arguments of the first couple meditations. But it's done so like in the context of Descartes' biography, or autobiography, I should say. So it's kind of like it captures a historical moment with a little more context than just the meditations themselves. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you learned some things. And yeah, I will do probably a follow-up to this on parts 5 and 6. I'll just say that I think that the most philosophy, or the most philosophically important stuff is in what we did today. It's in parts 1 to 4. Whereas part 5 and 6, again, that's more about like the application in science. And part 6 is more about like why he's writing this overall. So those are, I would say, of secondary concern to the seriously philosophically minded person who might be interested in this channel. So Yeah, but I'll do it anyway, just for the sake of completion, to have a part 2. Yeah, that's it. That's Descartes' Discourse on Method. Apologies for stumbling over some of the words in some places. Again, I think this translation is less than perfect. For whatever reason, but that's okay. We got through it, and I hope you learned some stuff. And that's it. I will see you in the next video. Take care.